Is the Deschutes County Budget Committee, and this is the mid-year budget update. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Nick Lelak.
Great, welcome everyone. Nice to see you. It seems like, as Bruce and I were chatting, it seems like it was just yesterday we were here adopting the fiscal year 24 budget. It's great to be together and check in and talk about a lot of big topics today, but the most important topic we have to kick it off with is the recognition of Bruce Barrett. So, Commissioner, would you like to start?
Sure.
And I can, we can each, whoever would like to provide comments may do so.
Bruce, thank you very much for your service for Deschutes County. You really, have been that steady reference point for me, coming in many years ago now. So when did you first join the Budget Committee?
I think it was 2006. There was 1 year of a term left over from somebody that had left the committee, and I was asked to fill that 1 year, and then I just hung around for a while.
Well, and thank you very much for your service, but, chairing the meetings, we let the conversations go and then you bring it right back. So thank you very much for what you've done and, just that long-term view of Deschutes County. As I say, when I got started, you learn about the choices made over a long period of time, 20 years ago, choices that were made, we get to benefit from now. So thank you very much for your service. Here's a plaque for you. For your office.
And
Yep.
photographer back here
Yeah.
who may want to get the nice photo, but Bruce, we can't thank you enough. I have enjoyed working with you. I've been in my position with the county since 2009, and I have enjoyed every budget year with you, and the last couple of years sitting right next to you. And you shared great comments with me after last year's budget committee that's not reflected in the survey. They said, Nick, there's a few things we could do to improve it going forward. And I appreciate that. I genuinely do. And I'll make those improvements going forward. We can talk about that later, but this is for you. And I want to make sure that if anybody else would like to provide comments, thank you for your service to Deschutes County.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Nick. I appreciate it. Yeah, it's been a great opportunity for me. Certainly all the things I've learned, and I'm hopefully passed along what I thought was relevant and at a timely point in our progress. So it is interesting to think back of all the people that I've been able to work with. I guess the big thing that comes to my mind when I think about the experience I've had here is just the integrity and professionalism that everybody operates at here at the county. I think back on the audits, and I've read through all of that material, and it's just surprising how well the county does in all of those audits, and the people that were involved and ran the system are to thank for that. So I think we're in good hands. We've got a great committee going forward, and I'm hopeful for the future.
Thank you very much.
And you can just imagine, if Bruce joined the budget committee in 2006, you can imagine what kind of change he's witnessed in that period, like a couple, the turbulence just a couple of years later. So thank you so much for being a great steward, a great financial steward for Deschutes County through that period. And, in your time as chair, a great steward for the group. As we work through that process every year.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
I want to thank you as well, Bruce. You've been a great chair. I'll echo Commissioner Chang's comments. You've really been great for the group. You bring us back and to the agenda, and you've just done a great job.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
It's a long time to serve the county as a volunteer. It's amazing. Thank you.
Yeah, it is interesting to see the changes. It's certainly got much more complex. We can thank people like Eric for that. Continuing to write policy and enforce it also. It isn't as easy a job as it was originally, so I can say that, but thankfully we have capable people.
And I'll just add my thanks. I sent you an email almost immediately and said I was going to miss you. I'm only missing you more already. I'll make sure next year as I go into budget season that I write down WWBS so I know. So I ask myself, what would Bruce say as we go into the deliberations? So thank you very much for your wisdom and support.
Thank you, Chris.
You know, you just saw the capital reserve graph about
Yeah.
where you're leaving. Yeah.
That was part of it. Yeah, I'll probably zoom in just to see how you're doing.
See how many hours you can hang out with us.
Yeah, how long I can stay awake.
Can't wait for the public comment.
That's only because of my age.
We'll have snacks in your honor.
Okay, nice. That works. Thank you.
Great. Guys, it is amazing. I mean, starting in at the height of the prior market to the Great Recession, to the long slope recovery, to the pandemic, and then here we are.
Wow.
It's, yeah, quite a
If-
remarkable tenure.
If we had known that, we probably wouldn't have done it, huh?
Well, thank you very much. Any final comments? This is great. This is certainly.
I'll just make, if I could, Nick, I'll
Yeah,
make one
please.
final comment. I've known this gentleman here for a number of years, and Bruce and I started serving together on the Deschutes County Forgivable Loan Program in probably 2012, I think, somewhere kind of in that range, just as we were coming out of the last pandemic. and
Right.
Certainly had a lot of involvement with the county and approving a number of companies that were trying to grow their workforce, and really encouraging to see the number of wins where those loans became forgiven as those companies achieved that loan growth or the job growth. And anyway, Bruce has been a wonderful contributor in that area as well, and I'm hopeful you'll continue to serve in that capacity.
Yep,
But it's
well,
been
well-
great working with you over the years.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Yeah. We're fortunate to have a guy like this working for the county, and we'll continue on with that. Well, I guess we're involved in 3 of those committees, right? So,
Okay, a couple of them out there.
yeah.
That'll keep you busy in
So,
retirement.
yeah, that'll give me a hand in
We
the
can do a little bit more of a formal photo. We could all stand kind of on that side if you want to get it from over
Right
there.
there.
Great.
You have.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, gotta have your. Go in front of.
Yeah, but
Do it right up here.
Going around here.
Oh, yeah, I'm eating.
Yeah, watch out for all the corn.
Who all would you like in the photos?
Oh, anybody. Step down. It's not a bad
I'll
thing.
get them there.
Yeah.
Yeah, Bill.
Come on here.
Our CFO.
Yes,
Budget
please.
officer. And then the people that actually really do the work with me.
So everybody is.
Yeah.
Well, we got, we used to have one of them. Be on the far end.
I think you're doing great.
Yes, good.
The number crew. I know, there you go, big smile. Thanks, Eric. And now you get to run last meeting.
If I can just, as we transition to our meeting, I'm going to turn it back over to our chair, but I would like to recognize that I believe we have Commissioner Adair online. And perhaps we can see her so that we know when to recognize Commissioner Adair during the meeting. I understand Chrisanna Clark Endicott, our new budget committee member, may also be online, if that's correct. And if so, we would like to welcome them virtually to the meeting, and I think that may be occurring. Commissioner Adair.
Thank you.
There you go.
Yes, welcome. And thank you, Bruce, for your unwavering service over a long time. So we definitely are going to miss you. And thank you for chairing this last meeting. And it is truly appreciated.
Thank you, Commissioner. I appreciate it. Robert, did you have some opening remarks?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Appreciate it. And I also do want to thank you for all your consistency. That's what I heard when I first started, it's been a year. And so when I first came on, it was really, there were gratitude expressed in your leadership of the Budget Committee and the consistency you brought to it. And so
Appreciate
we
it.
will miss that, and we definitely appreciate everything. But opening comments for the Budget Committee. I just want to say, since the last time the full Budget Committee got together, we had a few major events happen, and you're probably already aware, but I just want to recap that briefly for you. One of those items is we did go out with a bond like we talked about for the courthouse. So we had our meeting with Moody's Investor Service, and I just want to highlight a few items because it kind of sets the tone as well for this mid-year and looking at our long-term forecast and where we're at. And just let you know the comments that they made. We met with them on October 19th, and then on November 3rd, they expressed credit opinion of Deschutes County. Again, that's like a credit report on your own personal finance. The credit strengths they listed for us was that we had a solid reserve and liquidity levels, low fixed costs, our conservative budgeting practices. Those were really what highlighted the strengths that they made note of. Our rating outlook, they said, what could lead to an upgrade? So kind of outside of our control, because they also look at demographics and the economy, but meaningful strengthening in resident income levels, right? But internal for what Deschutes County can do, sustained increases in reserves and liquidity is if we want to maintain and lead to an upgrade. Factors that could lead to a downgrade, a material reduction in reserves and liquidity, which weaken the county's financial position. Just kind of the opposite. So if we don't maintain, if we lose our reserves, then that could lead to a downgrade. Also, significant increase in leverage and fixed costs could also lead to a downgrade. So I just mentioned that the positives and the factors that they look at for our credit rating. So as we review the information today, obviously we're not making any decisions, but just as we prep for the May budget committee meetings, we'll review these again, but we'll keep that in mind. One thing, again, conservative budgeting is a strength, reserves, liquidity, low costs. And so those are the things we're mindful of. And so as Dan's reviewing the information today, it's good just to keep that in the back of your mind as well. And we'll interject and talk about a few items as we go along. And that's it.
All right, we do have opportunity for public comment. Is there any public comment?
We have one person via phone, a number ending in 541.
It's probably. Go ahead and welcome them to go ahead and provide a comment. Okay.
All right, go ahead. If you have a comment, please.
This is Chrisanna Clark Endicott. I just wanted everyone to know that I am on the line and I see you. I'm sorry you don't see me. I tried to do the audio or the video, but I don't know that you have that capability here, but excited to join the committee.
Thank you. Thank you for that commitment. It's great to have somebody from Redmond. And look forward to hearing of your good work. Thank you for your participation. All right, let's transition to the finance update. Dan, is that you?
That's me. All right, well, it's that time of year again, budget time. Just want to thank everyone for being here, especially Bruce. As everybody said, 17 years, what a blessing for us to have that kind of knowledge. Thank you, and thank you to all the citizen volunteer committee members. We know that this is your time that you take out, and we really appreciate it. And just want to thank Angie and Brenda who record this and get meals ready and everything and make this such a lovely experience, and Cam and Laura who work on the budget team as well. So, all right, so this is kind of our county financial update, state of the county financial update prior to budget week, and we can just start digging into this. I have a PowerPoint that we'll put up there here in a sec, and we'll just move in. All right, so budget committee update. So today we'll be going over, in the past, we've kind of done a little bit of, we've done the county fiscal year update of where we're at in this current year fiscal actuals. And then we've waited, and at the back half, we've talked about the assumptions for the budget year. And it's kind of led to some stilted conversations. So this year we've kind of just combined those all together so that when we talk about general fund and TRT, we can just discuss the assumptions as we go. But we'll be talking about general fund, property taxes, transient room tax, capital reserves, and the courthouse funding. We'll be looking at some of our operational needs and updates, the health benefits reserve, kind of the countywide personnel, and assumptions in the American Rescue Plan. And then we'll talk about some updates to the budget process, including we did a budget survey last year and the survey results that came from that, the citizen budget community members, as well as our board. And lastly, we'll talk about our budget calendar. And if you have any questions as we go through this, just I'm happy to answer anything. Robert and Cam are here as well as our budget officer to answer anything. And it's just kind of a conversational flow. All right, so the purpose statement of this mid-year is a high-level focus on countywide financial perspective and budget assumptions. And then later on in the year, specifically on April 29th, which will be our pre-budget meeting, and then during budget week, we'll have more of a departmental focus where we look at special requests and departmental operations and capital needs. All right, so moving on to the finance update, we're going to start with the general fund and just overview of the general fund. The general fund is currently made up of departments, the district attorney's office, the clerk, the assessor's office, veterans, tax, property, and medical examiner's office. And it also supports other departmental transfers. So where there's operational subsidies needed in other core county services. The two largest amounts would be health services, specifically public health. More so than behavioral health, they're funded differently. Public health receives a large chunk of general fund, as well as does community justice juvenile. Both of them receive approximately $6.8 million annually in general fund. And we'll talk about that a bit here. But these departments are primarily supported through current year property tax dollars, which makes up 84% of our general fund revenue. And the property tax income is a function of the levy rate, the assessed tax growth rate, and the percent collected. And over the next 3 slides, we'll kind of be digging into each one of those as assumptions for fiscal year 25. But because the general fund supports our operational subsidies, and because property tax is the largest revenue, property tax really is kind of the backbone of the county in terms of its ability to prop up operations. Any question on general fund operations or any clarifications? All right. Seeing none. Let's talk about our property tax levy. So last year, we did a lot of analysis and we raised the general fund property tax rate. We increased it by 6 cents and levied the permanent full rate of $1.2783 per thousand of assessed value in FY24. And we did that to support vital operations at the current service level. And also it was necessary for courthouse debt service and any future capital plans. So right now our countywide permanent rate on this slide you'll see is at its full rate, as well as both the countywide law enforcement districts, Law Enforcement District 1, which is countywide, and then the Rural Law Enforcement District is also at its full rate. Moving forward, we'll talk about assessed value. So this chart right here looks at the assessed value year over year from fiscal year 7 to fiscal year 2024. We have had a 5.6% year average growth since 2015, kind of coming out of the tail end of the recession and a lot of permitting at that point. Last year, we budgeted 4.9% for assessed value growth. We did that, as Robert spoke to, one, because of the necessity of conservative budgeting for Moody's ratings and just fiscal stability, but also because when we were looking at county permitting levels and really city permitting levels, we saw a pretty large decrease, and we thought that would affect the assessed value growth negatively compared to our historical average. We've been blessed this year. We've had a 5.59% actual growth, which has been a realized gain over budget of about $730,000 in property taxes. So that's been excellent. And, here in Oregon, we do it based on assessed value, but we also have a market value, which is a great indicator of the actual market itself. We've had 14% year over year average growth since 2015, and a 10% growth in FY24 and a 30% growth in FY23.
I'll just acknowledge this is the window that Bruce has been here this whole time, FY07. So this is Bruce's window. But also the FY11 and 12 where it went flat. That's interesting with the Oregon tax system, 3% and usually the market value is higher, but there was a subset of properties that went negative for a few years during that Great Recession, and it hit us in the FY 11-12. So I mean, that it's interesting when, nobody had ever seen anything like that, and hopefully we won't see it again. And and then COVID, it's amazing. We look like, oh, hold on, it's going to go flat or something's going to happen, and then it just went up instead. People moved here and it got real expensive. So you kind of counterintuitive what happens sometimes.
And that's another reason why we try to budget conservatively to make up for those potential variances. So.
And the extra 730K that you're expecting to accrue is in general fund?
It is in the general fund, correct. And then there would have been some additional tax revenue,
Right.
LED 1 and LED 2 in the sheriff's office. All right, so assessed value assumptions. So right now, it's to be determined. We've talked with the assessor, but I think we'd like to speak with the assessor before really dig into kind of city permitting rates as well as some county permitting rates. I would imagine we always try to budget conservatively. So I don't know that it would be up at the 5.5%, but we try to look at economic indicators and things of that nature. But really, we're waiting to have an additional conversation with the assessor before we kind of come up with that. I think initially we were thinking somewhere in the 5.2, 5.3% range, but still looking for a little bit more data from those individuals. And as Robert said, we do try to budget those slightly conservatively as we spoke to support operations. The worst thing you can do from a budgetary perspective is to budget increase revenue and then fall short of that revenue, because then you don't have enough money to support your operational expenses in a balanced budget. So as we noted, that's the best practice by Moody's rating agency. Any questions or comments about assessed value or where folks feel, things are trending? Or
So one question, Robert, you mentioned, reserve levels. Basically, is it the most optimal thing to have the reserve level policy in place and then just aim for those levels? Because instead of just hoping, we have a policy that says we need to get from July 1st to November, a policy that says, we want a certain percentage in some of these areas of our organization. So then we just stick to our policy is kind of my observation there.
Yeah, I would agree, Commissioner DeBonne. Thank you for the question. It is good, yes, number one, to have a policy. And then the other thing they look at is, are you adhering to your policy?
and
Are you
that's
meeting your policy goals? So, and there is like one of our policies says, strive to maintain, right? So if you initiate it and you're working towards it, then that shows advancement improvement. So they look at that. And one thing they do look at all funds, they also focus on the general fund, but they also bring in all funds through the county, which is a change for Moody's in the last few years when they changed their methodology. But they are looking at the reserves, and they do focus a lot on the general fund.
Okay. And so the last component, besides the actual tax levy and the assessed value growth to your property tax, is your property tax collection rate. This graph shows the current and prior year collection rates. The green is the general fund. Gray is LED 1, yellow is LED 2 in the sheriff's office, and then the blue is 911 service district. We have a 7.1% year average increase since 2018. But I think it's important to remember that we've had multiple levies within the sheriff's office as well as in the county since that time period for the general fund. We have a 15% increase estimate in FY24 due to the increased tax levy rate. And as far as the collection percentage, we assume a 96% collection rate for FY25, and that is essentially year over year, we come in right at about 96%. There's not very much variance there. And then in terms of, if a property was to go into foreclosure, we would recoup the other 4%. So we typically recoup 100% of the property taxes. It's just how much we collect in this particular fiscal year.
And I just want to expand on that just a little. The 3% also is due to the discount rate that people, if they pay, obviously by November 15th, they get 3% discount. Our ultimate collection rate is about 99.9% up in that range through the foreclosure process. That's when it comes in prior year tax revenue, when we get that revenue. So just a distinction between current year tax revenue and then prior year tax revenue. ultimately that we receive.
Is there any cyclicality in the foreclosure cycle, or does that basically just a lag to just some type of time lag to your property tax issuance?
It is somewhat consistent in that there's always a process of certain properties that go through that. And then when we foreclose or take deed of the record, depending on when we get some of that revenue, and when we sell it. But as we know, also there's been a recent change in the Supreme Court for what you do with the proceeds and how you distribute that. So we're working through that process as well.
Thank you.
Side note.
What about 2000 FY 9, 10, 11 period, there was a point in time where there were people letting low value undeveloped properties be tax foreclosed when banks received them. So there was people losing their homes too because of the banking crisis. But all of a sudden, all the taxes were being paid by the banks because they didn't want to have that hanging over it. So it was a little choppy, but hopefully we won't see that much choppy ever again. But who knows?
And when the property changes hands, the deed changes hands, so property taxes have to be paid at that point. So that's how we usually always get our taxes paid.
So now we're going to do a little bit more detailed dive into general fund operations, specifically the expenditures, which I briefly mentioned earlier, departmental operating expenditures. So those departments within the general fund, like the DA, the assessor, those are the largest aggregate costs of the general fund. The second largest cost would be transfers out to subsidized departments and stand-up core services. The largest transfers, as we spoke to, were health services and community justice juvenile. General fund transfers this year will be for inflationary increase for personnel, and then transfer amounts are always evaluated on an individual basis for budget. And the general fund ending balance, we have projected to be about $1.5 million higher than budgeted. And a large reason for that is the conservative budget estimate on the actual assessed value. So $730,000 more on a $730,000 more within the general fund with property taxes. And then we have a significant amount of vacancy savings currently throughout the departments within the general fund.
On vacancy savings are a good and a bad thing. I mean, yes, you don't have the people, so you save the money, but at the same time, there's a bunch of things that don't get done, which then pushes some of the departments to say, oh, okay, I need extra funding or I need extra headcount to go do this, just because they're not seeing the work get done. So that's something I'm hoping, I know we're going to touch on later in terms of vacancy and how long they've been there. So
Then
I'll hold some of
overtime.
those.
Prolonged vacancies lead to overtime or additional incentive policies that
Mhm.
sometimes are substantial expenditure costs as well.
Yeah, and when you're talking about things like health services, if you're not addressing issues early, then they get much worse and
Yes.
they're more expensive too.
What was the old pay me now or pay me later commercial with that minus?
Yeah. Dan, before we leave this, well, maybe it makes sense to look at that next slide. So on this next slide, there's this big old bar that says district attorney. But on this slide, it said that the largest transfers are to health services and community justice juvenile. Like,
Justice departmental.
so is district attorney, that's not a transfer?
No, because it's a department within the general fund, we wouldn't consider that to be a transfer out. It's actually built inside the general fund, as is the assessors and the medical examiner's office and the court. Whereas transfers out would be to departments that are outside of Fund 001, the general fund. So 274 is our health services fund, or 030 is our community justice juvenile. And then we're actually transferring funds out of the general fund to those. But the other ones are just paid directly from property tax within the general fund per se. So it's kind of a.
I
But
had to
looking
read
at,
it a few times before I understood your color coding.
but looking
Yeah.
at this slide, I mean, is it correct to say that the largest departmental expenditure of general fund for, I assume this is for human resources, is actually the district attorney's office?
Yes, the largest expenditure in the general fund, besides our contingency policy that we have to have for cash flow reasons, is far and away the district attorney's office at this point. Their personnel typically grows at a little bit higher a rate in terms of because of the salary adjustments for attorneys and whatnot. So and of course, there was the study that they came back with a couple years ago that kind of reorged and added positions as well. So there's been substantial growth in the DA's office and they are a large expenditure to the general fund.
That's a discussion that could happen at AOC, reminding the legislature that we've got just a big cost center here. And, you know, we want to be a partner in this. We're supporting the facility also, and the legislature just needs to understand that. And I think our organization, Association of Board Counties, is definitely, you know, just made that known, the fact that it's expensive.
Yeah, if I recall, we actually had some discussion on this last year because it was the burden that the county is taking on for the DA's office is significantly outpacing the burden that is otherwise covered by the state.
Yes.
When we look at the general fund reserve or the transfer out to the capital reserve decreasing, it's not just external department transfers out, but it's actually internal departments within general fund as well, monitoring growth rates for all of those things. So that's correct. The DA would be the largest expenditure. And then on this slide, you can see the blue bars are all general fund departmental expenditures. And then the green is transfers out. Yellow is the contingency policy that we have for our general fund. We have that for cash flow purposes. We have 4 months of tax revenue that we need to hold to be able to pay the bills. And so that's why that is such a large number there. And then we have non-departmental expenditures, which are within the general fund, but they're usually more, vast majority of those are grants and contributions from the board to general fund. So example would be the Bend Heroes Foundation, Veterans Village. We hold those grants and contributions within the general fund as well.
Before you go on, getting back to Commissioner DeBone's question a few moments ago about the reserve fund though, and we're beginning to have this conversation internally at the staff level before we present it to the budget committee and the board, but we don't need to go into any details now, but we are beginning to talk about, so what should that reserve fund policy be in addition to the contingency? And so that could be another element to this draft chart going forward.
Right, because contingency is really for cash flow issues, whereas a reserve could be for operating deficits, emergency events, crises within the community, et cetera. Are there any other questions on the general fund expenditures graph or the general fund in general here?
And as you're just pausing for a moment, Commissioner Adair, we just want to make sure that we're here if you have questions or want to jump in with any comments as well. I just confirmed that she's available to jump in at any moment. All right.
Yes,
Good.
I'm hearing you guys loud and clearly in Las Vegas. Good job.
Great. Oh, thank you, Commissioner Adair.
Good that we're getting in over the thundering hose.
Thundering hooves.
Excuse me.
All right, so there's a lot to cover on this slide. This is the general fund's operations forecast. So first I'm going to speak to the graph a little bit. This orange bar right here is expenditures. The blue bar is our estimated revenue based on predominantly, like I said, 84% is that general fund property tax. And then the yellow bar is our contingency minimum that we were just looking at that we need for cash flow purposes and really for some operational needs too, if there was ever something to occur. And you can see that with our current expenditures, this model is based off a 6-7 year historical look back and our expenditure rate by department within the general fund and our historical growth rate by non-departmental transfers out. You can see at this rate that around FY35, our expenditure growth does start to surpass our general fund revenue. The county takes on approximately 1.4 million of unfunded in fiscal year 36. But it grows quickly to about 12 million by FY39. Again, there's some historical assumptions coming into this that we're going to continue to grow FTE wise, salary wise, at the same level within the general fund and departmental transfers out as we have over the last 5 to 6 years. The revenue assumption is 4.9%, I believe, for a 20-year assessed value growth. And then the beginning working capital, as we see, drops out in kind of FY39. There are some things that we don't really take into account here that I just want to put out there. We are looking at counties have to do salary and wage studies occasionally to make sure that we are in to make sure that our personnel is competitive, et cetera. And so those things usually bump up the historical rate significantly, and then you grow from that new personnel level. We have not taken into account that or any other what I would call stepwise jump. If there was an emergency situation and we had to spend $1 million, we don't have any of those things in the general fund operations forecast. We're simply looking at it from a historical perspective. And as we trend closer to a salary and wage adjustment, then we could likely see this expenditure bar bump quicker.
One other item that we don't include in there are any projects, large major projects that the general fund may be required to contribute to or build. That's not in this forecast either. This is just the basic operating cost based on those departments and transfers that you saw earlier, or any other, but also a few minor commitments that the board has made, or major commitments the board has made for funding projects over the next couple of years are built into the forecast as well. I also want to point out, and then we'll open up for questions as well. We saw a very similar graph to this last year during the budget committee, and Dan and the team will be updating this regularly. It looks really similar. But we are 1 year closer. You can see those red lines in the far right in the out years. You know, we can't really go negative. You can't go negative because we have to have a balanced budget, right? So we won't be experiencing the negative beginning working capital just because you can't. And so when we talk about the budget and in prep for the upcoming year's budget, and I just want to remind the budget committee that in the current year where we're at, things are looking, you know, our revenues are matching our expenditures, but in the out years is where there's that cliff, or there's those areas that there'll be a negative any working capital there. So what can we do today to slow the growth of the expenditures, right? Or increase the revenues? But even a small change in the expenditures, you can see, and we were just a minute ago talking about the DA's office, one of the largest, just as an example, one of the largest general fund users on a department level, that if you can slow the growth, the rate of growth, not eliminate it, right? But how can that impact the long-term forecast? So we're not faced with the cliff when we get there eventually. So that's why one of the jobs of the budget team here in the budget officer is I like to call it the protector of the general fund, or safeguarding the general fund, because it's our only discretionary fund, less a few TRT discretionary dollars. I mean, throw that in there, but it is the discretionary fund. So that's one of the main focuses we have from all of us here on the budget and admin. It's how can we safeguard the general fund? What small changes can we make so that we're not faced with that fiscal crisis a few years out? So we're going to be mindful of our rate of increase, the spending, and also where are our reserves so we can plan for that day. And so we're trying to be prudent in that way as well. Commissioner Cheng.
Yeah. So Dan, you said this is basically a projection out of historical trends.
Correct.
And that doesn't necessarily account for extraordinary things that could happen in the future. But I mean, I do believe that some extraordinary things have happened in our past,
sure,
which are then captured in the trend. You know, for example, the 2% bump that we just did. I mean, that is internal to these trends, right? And the big PERS buy down, things like that. So
PERS buy down might have been before we look, because I think we look at a 6-year historical. So I think PERS buy down and probably the last class and comp isn't quite included, but certainly the 2% would be, and you're correct. When we look at historical, we do capture some of those increases, right?
Not that should make us feel like, oh, it's all right, you know.
Right.
Historical trends will bear us out, but there is some there are some extraordinary things in our historical trends, so that offers us a little bit of buffering or kind of conservatism to this trend projection.
Yeah, I think we just want to call out things that we know may be coming that we haven't specifically, that will include in the forecast, but there are some certainly the 2% and other things that are included in there that were large kind of one-time steps.
So I was just trying to write down the major knobs that you had. So you're holding the tax rate flat, right? At the top rate.
Yeah, you can't, yeah.
Headcount is a small growth rate, salary is a fixed growth rate as well, or did you bump it based on contract years?
It depends on departments. We haven't, so we're looking at the historical within departments, and then to some degree, because there has been some large adjustments, we are kind of trying to tamper it out when you talk about a 20-year forecast, but it's based off the historical by department. So
There's a
different,
fair amount of inputs that goes into that.
yes, different departments have different bargaining units per se.
And then I think I heard you say property growth assumption at 4.9.
For a 20-year.
Okay.
Mhm. Right.
Any major knobs I missed?
I mean, it's pretty detailed. We will, in that actual forecast, we have debt service that's being removed. We have additional income that we're finding coming in. But I think the biggest knobs are always going to be personnel and assessed value growth rate.
All right, thank you.
So yesterday, Oregon's Leadership Summit, Business Oregon's big event I was at in Portland. And there was a kind of a voting effort by everybody in the room, electronic voting, and overhaul Oregon's tax structure was like number 2, I think, out of the 10 priority items. So I remember talking about 4 different mayors from around the state yesterday also. And cities are in a tighter spot than counties is the takeaway that I got yesterday. So it's good for us to have a feel for, our numbers and very detailed about our numbers. But cities are in a lot more panic mode than counties even right now. So I don't know if the legislature is going to pick this up, but it showed there was 2 or 3 items. One of them was K-12 school, long-term stability and funding, but this was right there with it in the room of people voting. So there's about 700 people just voting real time, but it was leadership from around the state, and the mayors kind of made that statement that, yeah, this is more critical for cities right now.
Does
Interesting.
the county bear the full cost of the attorney in the DA's office, or is there opportunity for shared services agreements with the state in the future to help reduce that cost?
We bear the full cost of the DA personnel. The DA himself is split between a shared cost. And I don't know if anyone knows if there's more opportunity to go out for additional shared costs with Oregon State.
I don't believe so. Those are county employees right
Right.
now. But
But I mean, that's certainly, whether it's a shared cost agreement or grant revenue, things of that nature, something that, maybe the budget committee can look at to see if there's other ways that they can have their costs covered. It is a growing expenditure. Attorneys and legal professionals tend to make more than other county staff. So we have a 5% step here at the county, plus we have the COLA on top of that. And so most individuals receive that. So when you think about that growth on a larger salary, it does seem to be a steeper curve than some other departments.
And even with all of that, the DA has been struggling to recruit, right? Additional DAs from out of region.
they are currently fully staffed, is my understanding right now. Yeah, with one vacancy that's not advertised at the moment. So I know, feeling good about that. Yeah.
Robert spoke to a lot of this, but this is the graph on the left here on the general fund operations forecast with differing growth assumptions. Graph on the left is the one we just saw. And basically, if you were to take all of the drivers that we have by department and aggregate them, the general fund, it varies by year, but on average, it's increasing about 5.5% historically. And that's kind of that graph on the left. Now, if you were to aggregate, only increase it by 4.8. So we're not talking about cuts or decreases or anything. We're talking about just a slower growth rate. It saves 120 million over 20 years. So that is a substantial difference. And you can see that this red bar down here at the beginning, working capital, is aligned with the contingency minimum policy. Certainly once you get out to 47 or so, the revenue and expenditures start decreasing and moving away, but it does save about 12 years with just kind of a smaller year over year general fund growth. And I think that's what Robert's talking about is if we start making choices today that are in line with that percentage, then we can effectively have fiscal stability in the future. And if our revenue assumption comes in higher than 4.9 over 20 years, great, we'll have even more. But if we wait another 2, 3, 4 years, then I won't be able to balance it with a 4.8% number. We'll have to say, what if we do it at 4.6, 4.5%? And so that's kind of the main question is looking at balancing that general fund and making sure that there's enough left over to cover our contingency policy and critical operations in the future. So, and I do have to say, well, actually, that's all I have to say on that. So, yeah.
Well, it's good to know that number. Being able to take this, the initial graph talking about 5.5 is in the history and the expectation and saying, what if, so 4.8, because all of a sudden we're talking about, less than 1% and it's really just managing the growth, which is always a better situation than being flat or going backwards like the 80s is what I'm referring to. So, but knowing that number is very valuable. Thank you for putting that scope out there for us.
Of course.
Well, my pre-holiday math would say that's about cutting about 12% a year, or cutting about 12% total in the budget at any given time, going from 5.5 to 4.8.
Yeah, it's 0.7 over 5.5.
So yeah, that's going to come mostly on the backs of personnel, because that's what all that really goes.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly, there's a lot of different areas. We have the role category, personnel, materials and services, capital. We also have grants and contributions out to other agencies within the general fund. But certainly personnel is the largest expenditure for the county. So that's generally where we would highlight.
And what's your because I haven't poked around enough on that. I could do some homework, but in terms of personnel cost growth versus materials and service cost growth, M&S should be lower. Is it significantly lower? Should be about a third of what personnel is, if I remember right.
I will say that it completely, and we haven't really, and maybe as the general fund continues to grow, we'll have more in-depth conversations about what the general fund, the departments and the transfers look like. But I can tell you that there are some departments that are growing at almost 9 or 10%. And there are other departments inside the general fund that are growing at 3.5%. Same with the transfers out. There's some transfers out. I have to say both public health and community justice juvenile, they transfer out at about 3.5, 4%. So just an inflationary rate every year. But there are other departments that have a much larger growing, and it's a smaller transfer, but it is growing at 15% or something like that year over year. And so those are kind of, I would say it's hard to say pin down because each department, each transfer is quite different in terms of expenditure. But if we, that's something that certainly as the budget week or even pre-budget week, we could do a deeper dive into, because there are areas that are growing up and there's areas that are staying relatively flat.
Well, it would be interesting to know, just maybe just even as a summary in the pre-budget meeting of here's where we are seeing the significant growth, here's where we're seeing standard growth, because then that gives us the idea as to, well, where should we focus a little more in terms of trying to find some of that 12%.
One of the other dimensions of this, though, is, and this gets at what Judy was just saying the other day, a couple minutes ago, is that many of the county's departments have other revenue sources besides general fund.
Right.
So, I mean, even to kind of home in on some of the ones that are on this chart, not so much juvenile justice, but community justice. The community justice department overall, at least on the adult side, the community justice department overall is a shared responsibility between the state and the county. So the state has historically covered most of the adult. The county has historically covered the juvenile end of the equation. But now we're seeing, in the last budget cycle, we saw that the state really chintz on their adult contribution. Health services, that for $6.8 million is a substantial amount of general fund to go into a department, but that's part of overall something like a over $60 million a year budget department. So
Although a lot of
vast
the general
majority.
fund is public health, if I remember right.
yeah,
Most of it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so it's, you can look at that and you can, it's, to some degree, we need to look at it and say, okay. We're spending more resources on public health, we'll just, you seeing as we just, I'm fake exampling it, sorry. But seeing as we just came out of a pandemic, maybe we should be. Oh, we're spending more on juvenile justice, well, because we don't want them to turn into adult justice problems later on, like
Yeah.
we were just
Yeah.
talking a little
no,
bit
I mean,
about.
these are all strategic things to
Yeah.
be investing in.
So some of it, and this will come up, I'll probably raise a similar thing in term, when we get to TRT in a little bit. But we should probably just, at least try and spend a little bit of time on on all the different pieces that are growing to say, why are they growing and what trade-offs are we actually either saving or exacerbating because they're growing at that rate? Because we might have to acknowledge that at some point or another that, well, the county needs to function this way. And that's more a message to the budget committee. But in the very least, the budget committee should be acknowledging, yes, either this is a necessary growth thing and we need to find other places to cut, or we just need to overall cut services and see if they get picked up elsewhere in the community.
Or the third piece of this that I'm emphasizing is, if this is a necessary service and someone else could pay for it, how do we get that? I mean, like, it's a very small amount of money, but the environmental health division, still hasn't really raised its fees for kitchen inspections yet. Right. We've been, we were trying to, to treat that sector very gently coming out of COVID. But the net result is that we're taking the general fund or other county dollars to subsidize that service for the community. So, if there are other ways to pay for the services that our community needs, then we should be exploring those to the fullest. And to go back to the district attorneys, I mean, this is district attorney functions are a mandated service from the state of Oregon, and they should be contributing more than they are. And certainly that was historically the case, that the state contributed more than they are right now. So we could make that a focus of targeted advocacy, fiscal, funding advocacy.
I agree.
Well, you do have to be careful about that, because if you start talking about state pooled resources to be able to support a statewide set of things like district attorney, Deschutes County, if you look at the school budget, Deschutes County tends to lose in that more money goes out of the county than comes back in the county once you do those full resources. So there's some different formulas that we need to advocate for. Otherwise, we're deciding we're not going to rob Peter on this side, but we're going to rob Peter on the other side from state funds.
I do think it's important to look at other ways to generate revenue for the different departments. And I think there's ways to do that. And I think the county can be successful in doing that. Services are not going to shrink. So we can't have this on the backs of 10 to 12% of the employees when their services are going to grow. There's going to be less of them doing the work. So I think it's a combination of things that we're going to need to look at to help generate more revenue. And the restaurants are a perfect example. If you raise their fees for the inspections, and really they are such a low percentage of profit margins in a restaurant, and you run off restaurants and you're a tourism economy, and you don't have enough restaurants to feed people, then they're going to go somewhere else. So I think, it can get complicated, but I think there is ways that we can look at. I can't think of an example for how to, raise funding for revenue for inspections, but I think there's a way to look at the different categories and what they're funding, and what grants are available, and what Ways and Means can do, and what the county can do to shrink a little bit. I think it's a combination of things that we're going to have to do so that the county isn't burdened with all of these services in the future, and then have less personnel or cuts to their pay or their health benefits. funding increasing. I mean, it's a combination of all of that. But we just need to keep an open mind, I think, with the
It's
state.
definitely not either or. It's not,
Right.
it's not either,
Mhm.
either carefully look at staffing and growth of staffing and be strategic and smart, or raise more revenue. It's both.
Well, we actually had some of these conversations for a little bit last year, and I'm not picking on the two departments, but the two I remember were the clerk and the assessor. Where they both talked about our charges for services are going down significantly. We're not selling as many maps. We're not doing as many dog licenses or anything else like that. So you can address that in a couple of ways. You can say, okay, what's my marketing plan to get more licenses done? Not that the libertarian in me is really a fan of more licensing, but I put it out there. But then the other aspect is, okay, let's just not do it and save the personnel. And acknowledge that we're not gonna pull the money off of it. Is there an analysis there that says, and I realize we're playing with people's lives here, so I'm gonna be careful. But is there an acknowledgement that says, if we're not gonna get the revenue on it, should we even be trying? And is there a cost savings that gets us to that 4.8 as a result?
I mean, we certainly should look at the benefit, the impacts of all our human resource investments, and also the cost and how you pay for it.
I would,
Dog census, a
So
lot of dogs. in Deschutes County.
I got two.
and I would just say, so obviously optimization of revenue is really important. And then maybe for our April 29th meeting, we can have a little bit of a deeper dive into the general fund, look at those expenditure rates that have grown and not grown. Yeah, so we can definitely do that.
Yeah, I also want to just emphasize, as we look at some of these and the growth and the trade-offs, those are gonna be really important discussions for us to have. 3 departments we have spent a lot of time on that I think that haven't grown as they need to grow. And that's the other piece, human resources being one,
Mhm.
IT is another with what we're seeing with cybersecurity and just facilities. Given the age of the facilities that we have here in our downtown campus and across the county. So those are 3 that I think the board, I know the board and budget office committee, we're gonna be exploring options going forward. Each of those really core functions for the county as we go forward. So it's just, we mentioned some of them that are growing, some of them other revenues, but we have some that have just done everything they can to stay afloat, and we're going to need to make greater investments in some of those other areas.
And are you driving a strategic planning process to do that, or are you just saying?
Yeah, great question.
Great thoughts.
Great question. So our IT department, our new IT director has created a strategic plan. She's going to be bringing that forward to the board. I can't recall precisely where that's at right now, but that's exactly what's happening. Human resources is doing exactly that, as is facilities. So each of those departments will be doing exactly that and thinking about what does their organizational structure look like going forward, and we'll be bringing each of those forward. Yeah. So that everybody can make informed decisions on what those trade-offs are as well. Yeah.
I highly recommend that as a process. It comes out, it doesn't always satisfy you with it, but it gives you at least insights to at least tell you why you are where you are.
Exactly. Yeah.
And I would just say, and in terms of when we talk about what would a 4.8% actual growth look like and things like that? Obviously, it's a combination of the revenue, the expenditure, and other things. But one way that you could actually, on a technical side, do that is if you budget 96%, right? 96% is your actuals, then you know about 5%. If you budget 5%, then you'll land at about 4.8% actual, right? And so that's a technical way that if we decide to go forward with that in the future, you would have a very good idea of where you would land at based on how much the budgeted increases year over year. All right, any more questions on the general fund before we move to our other discretionary income source, TRT? Transient room. All right.
That was a good discussion.
Yeah, that was a great discussion. Transient room tax, Fund 160 and 170. So this graph is just the actuals from FY10 to, projecting here at FY24. We've had a 1.2% year average from 2000 to 2012. So very small. And then of course we had that huge jump. Really that jump came from in FY21 when we saw COVID-19. We are actually just got new TRT numbers in today. So we're projecting just slightly less than 12.4 million. We were at 12.45, but we're about 60,000 down from that. And so we're probably going to be at about 240,000 less than budgeted. as of right now. The potential surplus of the transient room tax has been the last few years transferred to the capital reserve for future debt and capital needs. And just to go back on the history of that, originally it was that capital reserve was about to be $1.9 million. It had gone from about 12 to 1.9 because we were blessed enough to pay in cash for some capital assets. But we needed about a $3.5 million TRT transfer to prop up our county capital reserve. And then last year, of course, as we started looking at the courthouse, we realized we needed those TRT payments to cover the debt service for the courthouse. And so that's why we've been transferring that transient room tax and have that as a continued best practice at this point in time.
So big snow during the holidays is gonna fix it though. So we just gotta,
Well, big
Pray
snow
for
during the
snow.
holidays, no smoke during summer.
oh yeah, that too. But for this fiscal year, big snow during the holidays.
When there's big snow.
Yep.
Speaking
Yeah,
of
I was gonna say,
services that
I
are
thought those,
absolutely
yeah.
needed, but they're not generating any revenue for us.
Yeah. It's interesting because if you actually go at that 1.2 increase and you back that out and then, remove the, our COVID bonus, I guess. TRT could be flat through probably 2030, 2022 before it actually catches back up with the 1.2 curve from historical. So if you're playing guardrails, the bad news is TRT could be flat for a really long time, and that would be perfectly normal sans pandemic.
Yep.
What did my mom used to tell me, sometimes you don't get cookies all the time at Christmas.
What?
We weren't all that well off.
Yeah.
A big lump of coal.
Well, but that was definitely a point in time. We were able to utilize those revenues, but yeah, the reality is that could be flat or even, just recalibrating, whatever that means here in the next few years.
And we poked around a little bit last year in terms of is TRT something that we want to use project-based? Is TRT something that we want to use to, fund lagging areas or other things like that? Again, that's a policy decision that comes back to the budget committee, but it is something that would be really interesting to understand what the county wants to do philosophically with TRT so that we have a better idea as to how it should be allocated. Might have a little more to say on that next slide.
Well, if it generates TRTs, I look at that with the rodeo grounds or with the Deschutes County Fairgrounds. So the maintenance on that, they need funding for that. So something that's generating TRT, a portion of it should at least go back to maintaining the facility.
Well, and legislatively, there's a fair amount of that goes in. And Dan, I'm trying to remember what, I sat in Dan's office and we were playing with numbers. It's probably more of a discussion for the next slide, but there is a little overage in terms of what we give to some of the, required areas, tourism, fairgrounds, in terms of what we absolutely need to give them. And there's a question as to whether that's something that we should recover for elsewhere, or whether those really are the things that we should be overfunding and maybe we should be giving them more.
There's a percentage of the Fair and Expo. I think it's 30% of the Fair and Expo that is discretionary, right? And last year there was a budget committee committee decision to give that, because we actually think we're moving it to the courthouse buy down, but there was a discussion to give that to the Fair and Expo because of the presentation that Jeff Hines did. And Bill, I think, was there for that presentation on the Fair Board with respect to their long-term capital needs. So that is definitely available. And then there's the interpretation of the 1%, right? That goes to the VCO. It has to go for marketing. I guess the question is just sometimes does it need to go specifically to that organization?
I think when I was poking through the numbers that I had, which went back 4 or 5 years, there's a consistent overage of about 200K. And then depending on how you define travel and tourism, thanks for sending that lawsuit over, Nick. It could be $750,000 that we're actually overpaying in tourism. It's not a good thing. It's not a bad thing. It's just the thing that we've been doing. It's the discussion that we need to have in terms of, is that the right thing from what the county wants to, as a policy, to how the budget should respond.
And the 200K, yeah, that's what the 200K is, that slice of the fair and
Yeah, to the
expo.
fairgrounds.
The other 3.5 number, it varies depending, is the VCO payment, so.
And I want to thank you, Dan, for paying for capital projects when you can to reduce the debt service.
Yes.
That's huge. You'd be surprised how many municipalities and counties don't do that even when they have the money. We built a city hall once. It was a $2 or $3 million project, and that we had that way far and above. And I said, well, just pay for it. Judy, that's not the way it's done. We're taking out 20.
Never
years.
use today's dollars. on
Yeah,
tomorrow, yeah.
20, so they've been paying on that for 20 years and God knows what the debt service is. So thank you for being fiscally conservative and helping the county in that way.
Thank you, yeah. Everyone's.
Been Bruce the whole time.
Yeah. We hold a very small overall debt service, which is great compared to our one.
Just expanding on the conversation a little more on TRT. I wanted just to, for clarity for those listening or everyone in the room, the 30% you're talking about, it's 1% that goes to the fair board, 70% has to be for tourism. And it's that 30% of that 1% that is the discretionary that can go for any general government services that we have been dedicating. The budget committee has been dedicating that to the fair assets. A little bit about TRT revenues. I just got some of the numbers in recently through November. Year to date compared to last year, it's down 2.3%. So if we remain flat, that could be a good thing. But what we're experiencing now is down 2.3%, which is a larger decrease than last month. We were year to date, we were only down 1.6%. In the month of November alone, and this is when the revenue reaches us, so it's a month delayed from when the actual room taxes at the hotels, transient room tax, and then they have 30 days to submit it to us. However, November alone was down 10%. So that was the largest. And July through October are typically our largest revenue months for TRT. And so now that we're into November and it was down 10%. So, you know, the projections that Dan has, as we'll see on the next slide, was assuming flat. It doesn't necessarily assume, you know, a 2% decrease, or as we get farther through the year with our experience of our actuals, that's where we'll see how much will we actually end up budgeting for next fiscal year based on our trends. So we will be looking at that a lot closely. Obviously, we look at it every month, but we will be monitoring that.
When and I remember asking the question earlier, and gee, that would be, you know, I don't know, that would be a good thing to try and figure out. Is TRT down? Well, or how much is TRT down, or how much are room rentals down? Because room rates, at least from what a lot of places are reporting, are going up significantly. Yet, and so you should be getting more TRT off of that. So that would say you're getting a significant dearth in terms of actual room rentals. So the question is, can we get a better idea of how room rates are really going? November could have been as much the room rates are down because there's no snow on the mountain, but it also could have been the room rates are down because I'm dropping my room rates to try and get people in, and so the TRT is coming down. And maybe that's a thing that COVA could be able to dig in with us, because they should be able to go to most of the constituencies and ask them for the data and then anonymize it and present it. So, I mean, that's a very useful thing that they could do for us.
So what's driving the TRT?
Yeah,
Is it
what's
occupancy?
driving the TRT? Because, and again, that probably then is something good for COVA to know, because then if it really is, okay, we need other ways to drive this up, then maybe that's where the future fund comes in, or maybe that's where marketing and advertising comes in, trying to drag stuff on the shoulder seasons. But if it's really just down, if we don't know why it's staying flat, we don't have any idea as to how to help the area grow it.
Yeah, they're actually wondering the same thing. They were experiencing, they were hearing experiences of occupancy down 5% or more, yet our revenue as of last month was only down 2%. So they were questioning that as well. One thing we don't get occupancy rates, you know, we don't know occupancy percentages when, you know, we receive the revenue. We don't have the statistics on that, but you're right. PCO can help on some of those.
There are agencies that have figured out how to collect that. And we
Jim,
can,
I would say anecdotally, that information is available out there. I think that's a worthwhile endeavor to go back and kind of mine that data and see what's actually happening. I don't think there's been that many additional rooms coming online. So I think a lot of that increase has been driven by rack rate, by the average room rate. And if they're discounting rooms to fill to achieve an occupancy level, then, you know, that's obviously not sustainable either.
yeah, so I mean, it'd just be interesting to know that, know what we have to to be able to figure out how to address it, because maybe that does say, well, okay, COVID's time to get back into the marketing business to try and, get the shoulder seasons up, or, whatever. And I think they'll be able to figure it out, but I'm just encouraging them to go collect the data. And when we're not in a public meeting, I can give you some ideas to take to them as to how to get those occupancy rates.
Yeah, the other part of that is, the business room tax revenue had decreased, but the private had increased. So
I
there
did see that.
multiple, scenarios and contributing factors.
And those reductions are
Can I-
tracking along. These other than Redmond, I think they are up 15%. So Redmond's doing a great job. But the
We've
other
had a lot
ones,
of new rooms come online
Yeah.
too up there with some of those new properties that have been developed. So that's
Okay.
boosting revenue revenues.
I thought I heard Patty.
I did. I wanted to make a comment. I think it was about a month ago, maybe 5 weeks ago. The Wall Street Journal had Mount Bachelor as number 5 best ski resort in North America. So, we do, as Commissioner Bones said, we do need the snow. And then I did want to mention that the Sisters Rodeo Grounds has mentioned to me that they really need to do some major improvements there. They were talking about $1 million. So that's something that's out there. I'm not quite sure where that funding can come from. But yes, definitely snow makes a difference. And then the other thing to consider is if we honestly are having 58 days of smoke in the summer on average in Bend, that's really not going to help our, people coming to visit that time of year. So we're going to have to really think about that.
I could just mention one other piece of the TRT story. The county just completed a campground feasibility study for a couple of county properties, across the county. One of which is just a little north of here, a property that could host something like a 200 to 300 site campground, and campsite fees do generate transient room tax revenue. So we could, and that project in and of itself had a pretty good payback, pretty good return on investment if it could be built. It's going to cost $20 million for 300 sites. But it did have a pretty good return on investment because, what the study found was, while we've seen substantial growth in hotel room capacity over the decades, we have seen very little growth in campsite, campsite capacity. So you have places like Tumalo State Park that in the middle of summer is like 98% occupancy for 4 or 5 months. So there's a latent market demand there that could be met, but also would require significant initial capital investment.
And it's unincorporated area.
Yep, county owned land, just about a mile north of the urban growth boundary.
well, they're good money makers. I mean, it's a philosophy. Does the county want to get into private sector businesses to raise funds? I mean,
And how much are you gonna take out of your own fairgrounds or other areas if you have it? The area very likely can sustain camping. I'm sure that's what the study essentially came back with. There's not enough spots here that people want to use. But it's more a question of, what's the long-term impact and how would you model that across all the different businesses and properties that otherwise impact the county?
And I mean, this is just the consultants, but they said, based on experience from other places, that this tends not to cannibalize other providers. You may see a very short-term initial dip, but then the demand will expand to the existing capacity.
Okay, so now we're gonna look at the in-depth the expenditures by category here. I think we're gonna flip back to the presentation. So on this graph, we have kind of the 5 expenditure categories of TRT in general. We have grants and contributions first. As we know, we did an $8 million commitment to the Sun River Service District. We still have $2 million of that this year and $1 million to Mount Bachelor Biomass Project. In fiscal year 25, we will also have, that'll be our final payment to Sun River of $2 million at that point in time. In the general county category, this orange category, it includes transfers to health services. This is not the general fund transfer to public health. This is, as Commissioner Chang spoke to, this is the environmental health restaurant inspection fee transfer, which was reduced last year, but we still transfer that. It also includes operational subsidies for justice court, but the vast majority of it is the TRT that's been moved over to the capital reserve for courthouse, future courthouse debt service and capital projects. Law enforcement received $3.6 million roughly last year. That's Service District 1 and 2 to provide for their operations, tourism and facilities. This is that royal blue category right there. That is the Fair and Expo percent. As Jim was talking about, 30% of that amount, this 1.5 million, is available for allocated discretionary. And as in the past, we've given it to them for their future capital plan, but it's certainly a budget conversation that can occur. This green portion is the VCO portion, the portion that we give to Visit Central Oregon for their marketing and the other tourism related activities that they have. So that's just kind of a more detailed slide. Are there any questions on that? Okay.
There's a little bit of fungibility that you can do between the green and the royal blue in terms of if it's still allocated to tourism, I have the ability to move money back and forth between that, although some of that is contractual, and then you have to discuss whether you want to go through the contracts or not. But, you know, a lot of the rest of this, like we were just saying in terms of general fund, okay, you know, specific department, what are you doing with general funds? How do you otherwise gain revenue, and or how do you otherwise cut services? You know, there's probably a couple in that 2/3 of the pie that they should at least go through an exercise that says, okay, if you didn't have this money, what would that do and how would that impact the operation?
Right. And
because it's all unallocated, so it can be allocated however we want. And if there are capital projects and or if we want to you know, cover overages, potential overages in capital projects, what you're giving up is something out of that 2/3. This is that you know, that 8 million is basically the fungible money that the county has.
yes. Right. And with health services, in terms of their environmental health inspections, you know, that's a function of the fee schedule, which goes to the board every year. And that's always the conversation. Do we want to pay for environmental health? Which is, you know, critically important that we have restaurant inspections. I'm sure that's probably a mandated service of some sort. But the question is, do we want to fund that out of unallocated TRT, or do we want the fee charged to reflect the actual cost of service to the restaurant owner themselves, right? And so that's kind of that happens. Typically it's part of the budget process, but it happens outside of the budget committee with the fee schedule. And that would be some areas where we could look at revenue optimization, although we're constrained to the legal constraints of that it needs to be the actual cost of service when we look at those fees, as opposed to you know, a charge that generally wouldn't create revenue per se for those services.
It's probably going up significantly just because of all the food carts. And if you wanted to switch money between the green and the blue, I believe there's a 1-year notice in the contract to look at that. green pot.
Yeah, I'm not sure on the time frame, but you would have to notify.
Yeah, so I mean, that's,
You have to decide whether you want to do it and then at least provide the notice, and then you can decide what the change would be at some point or another, but you have to, in the very least, say, okay, we're gonna consider it, and then go from there.
Yeah, right. So there is a contract clause there. We would have to let them know that we're considering a different allocation to the BCO. It still needs to go to, you know, what's the legal mandate for TRT, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it needs to go to the BCO per se. Right. Um,
Would just be nice, all the departments, I mean, I'm looking at law enforcement, as an example, if the sheriff comes in and says, actually, this is what we are doing with the TRT, if it's, well, we're generally sloshing it into the budget and trying to figure out, what holes we're otherwise covering, how much of that can be, saved or recovered through better budgeting. And so it's not a demand one way or another. It's just really coming back to, as you're looking at the grants and the contributions, general county's a little rougher, but law enforcement, can you come back and actually justify what it is that you're doing? And same to the fairgrounds, by the way, it's, again, we're giving them the extra 30%. Is there a capital master plan that's actually backing that up in terms of how they're delivering or driving that? Or is that money that can be used more usefully? It's, the COVID thing is separate just because of a contract space, but really understanding what they're doing with it and how they're doing it. And could that be used for other travel and tourism focuses? I just think it's, again, you've got $12 million here that, yes, it's allocated in certain areas, but you've got money to move around. And at this point, $3 to $4 million might make a significant difference in the county budget. I'd really encourage us to be pretty demanding in terms of this portion of the budget that all of those are using, in terms of how they're using it, justify the amount that they're getting, and really give what if scenarios on what would happen if it wasn't there.
so Jim, am I hearing you say we should consider the VCO allocation?
But
All of these allocations, we should take a
Yeah.
careful look at.
I just wanted to hear, because per the contract, if we're considering changing, we need to say that.
I mean, that, again, that's policy. That's up to the county on
Right.
what they want to do. I'm just saying, and it's the same thing I've asked VCO the time I've been on the budget committee, but I want to ask the same thing out of the fairgrounds and the sheriff and the rest of, just tell me what it is that you're doing with it and how you're using it. And let's actually look and determine, is that the best way to be able to use this resource? Because, again, I'm going to say a couple $1 million of this refocused could make a significant difference in the health of the county. As you say, start now before you can't stop it.
Jim, you're asking the tough questions. You're exactly right.
I thought that's why you, pay me.
Yeah.
I appreciate it. Robert and I've had this conversation with Lane County. And we're not going down this rabbit hole right now, but with video lottery, for example, they don't just have ongoing allocations to all these organizations every year. Every year they step back. What are our priorities this year? And then they fund those priorities, which is a fundamentally different model than what we have. And I'm not saying one's better than the other, but it's a paradigm shift to think about that way. And I appreciate you raising the issue.
I had a friend, and when we ran planning in high tech, one of the things that we used to occasionally ask, we wouldn't ask them every department every year because they'd catch on, but we would eventually go to them and say, okay, we think we're going to cut your budget by 50%. What are you going to do? And they go, well, that's crazy. I'm not going to be able to do this and this. Well, tell me what you're going to do, because that tells me what's important to you. I think a similar type of question is something that we should be asking across all the departments on use of general fund, on use of TRT. Just let's really understand what's important to them. And again, it might come back to, I don't need to do this service. And maybe the best thing to do is just to cut it and acknowledge that we either don't want to or can't do it. And then go figure out whether there's another way for that to get picked up.
Oh, I just want,
The distinction between the tech sector and a county government being that there's a whole bunch of mandated services.
I get it.
So I mean, if you ask that question and people come back and say, well, these are the mandated services, so I'd cut all of this cutting edge, innovative, impactful stuff that we're doing, that's a pretty lousy answer.
That's what they used to do to me. And then I'd tell them to try again. Patty, I think I heard you.
yes, I was trying to make a comment. I do know that COVA is up to 10 employees. for our tourism promotion. It just seems like they just kept adding and adding and adding employees. So if we're talking about doing something differently, I appreciate that.
PRT is going down. They're adding.
Okay. Thank you, Commissioner Dare. Thank you. All right, moving on to the FY25 TRT assumptions. As we've talked about, it's highly variable and difficult to project. We've all talked about it, whether it's snow conditions, the general economy, smoke and fire, even things like airline rates, inflation, all those things play a huge deal with TRT. It's difficult, as Jim's been talking to exactly see if it's occupancy rate or something else. Our placeholder number, I'm not sure I call it a placeholder, or a projection, but our placeholder is 12.6 million. The reason for that is in our high year of 13.1 million, we were actually trending pretty similar to where we are right now. We were low and then we came in very high at the end of the year. So we'll see. It's still only halfway through, but we are trending in a linear fashion about 12.3, just under $12.4 million. But right now, just a placeholder for 12.6. When we come talk to this group in April, we'll have a more dialed in number for sure. TRT remainder after expenditures is forecasted to be transferred for debt service and capital needs, whether that's maintenance or capital strategy for long-term financial stability.
So some of the capital things that I think about are jail projects. We did a jail tour the other day, and just the entry and the meeting rooms, the lawyer rooms. There's a couple $1 million. So if it was a $2 million project, it'd be nice to get that done. The kitchen and laundry has always been talked about. So not the 10, 40, $80 million stuff, but the $2 million projects. And then the clerk's office, and basically upstairs, the clerk's office really does need a lot more room. So I just put those in perspective, thinking, okay, wanting to drop those into a budget someday or plan for them. Millions of dollars every time we touch a project like that, which is kind of the plan that Lee will come up with, some of these project ideas, but everything's expensive.
Well, it's an issue when you get to, if you're talking capital projects, everybody hoped that the building costs would stay stable, but especially when you're talking about high security or multiple audience areas like the jail, the courthouse, those numbers are getting $550, $575 a square foot. Just warehouse space is getting over $400 a square foot these days. So that's not going to get any better, especially because we're not seeing the labor force to be able to fulfill what the subs need to actually do that work. So with those costs going up, some of the questions to maybe ask are, should we be building now because we're not going to be able to build it all later? I'm seeing similar things in terms of big capital equipment purchases. An example from another context was Sun River actually deferred a piece of fire equipment by a year, figuring, we don't need it. In that intervening year, the cost doubled. So now we're paying twice what we have to for something that we need. So trying to be fiscally responsible actually bit us. Now we'd probably still make that decision again, but that's something I think that you need to encourage everybody to do is, okay, where's your projection going? And what, where are your reserve studies telling you that you actually need to buy versus you have to buy before it goes beyond control?
Just for the jail specifically, the last 5 years, it's like, we need to do this, this, and this. And we've been saying the same thing for 5 years. And, it's just got to come around at some point. So just acknowledging that.
And the folks at the jail, for a couple of years, were saying, well, how about we run a bond measure? And I mean, the bond measure,
It's not a real sexy bond.
what was it, 15 years ago? It didn't fly. Was it 15 years ago? I can't remember when
2006.
15 years ago. It didn't fly, and so it's a pretty hard one to consider running a bond measure for. Also, to square up the sheriff's office budget, just recently we did a substantial drawdown of their reserves of their contingency in order to balance out the numbers for the year, because their beginning fund balance was a couple $1 million less than they had projected it was going to be. And so to go back to our bond rating and, you know, how we maintain our bond rating with, you know, reserves and liquidity, having your contingency down close to nothing is not so good for being able to debt finance those projects at the jail if we need them.
I mean, that goes to sheriffs, that probably goes to roads department, some of the others, anybody that really is building off of saving contingency and pulling money at you know, beyond year start. All of those need kind of an examination. Some are run better than others, I understand.
You know,
Are we okay with a 10-minute break? You want to make a comment?
I was just gonna say, one of the things that maybe it's my former planning background, but I appreciate hearing the need for the plans going forward, because we are creating the public safety campus plan, and commissioners will have an individual briefing on that next week, which is great. It talks about what the projects are and the potential funding. We mentioned the Fair and Expo. We are planning to kick off the Fair and Expo master plan next year, which is great. The clerk's office, which needs space, they've conducted a space planning. So a lot of these pieces are in one phase or another. So we are thinking through all of it. Not all of it is, in fact, none of it is before you today, but there's a lot of work that we're coordinating on at the staff level. So I appreciate thinking about how we put these pieces together going forward. Thank you. I just wanted to share that.
Dan, go ahead and then let's take a
Yeah,
break.
we just have one more TRT slide as long as we're on here. Long-term forecast for TRT. Blue is the total revenue. The orange line is the total expenditures. You can see in FY24 and FY25. We have more outgoing expenditures than we have incoming revenue, and that's what we have our TRT reserve for. It's probably it was budgeted at 2 million. Due to the courthouse coming in at a lower interest rate, it'll probably be slightly over that, but actually our TRT will be coming in probably less than we budgeted, but they'll more than compensate for each other. The thing that I'm concerned about, frankly, on this is our TRT forecast that feeds into our capital reserve policy. A few years ago when we started making this, 2.5% revenue assumption seemed pretty conservative. At this point in time, watching TRT go flat and now going down, this is a 20-year projection, but it is not looking nearly as conservative. And because these TRT funds are so vital to us, it has been an internal conversation. We've looked at adjusting that rate from a finance perspective because it does change a lot of the financial picture. But for right now, we are assuming 2.5% revenue growth, 2.5% internal operational expenditure growth, but we are not assuming any more community projects or community grants of TRT for this. And the annual revenue over expenditure is forecasted to be needed for capital maintenance. And if we don't address the general fund operational issue as we get closer to it, right? And that continues to be the historical expenditure trend. We will need to use, this will be the only other funding source that we would really have availability to use to cover those operational deficits and keep core services. So this forecast does show this difference between revenue and expenditure going to capital maintenance needs and operational needs in the future.
Little hook at the end is debt service being
That's
retired.
debt service dropping off right there. Yep. So if there's any questions, great. If not,
Take a break. And we'll turn it back over to Dan.
Can I just say one thing? as we
Yeah.
start? I just, as we reconvene, as we have had in prior, budget committee years and meetings, we've had our county internal auditor attend, and we do this year too. Elizabeth Pate, our new county internal auditor, and just want to recognize her and welcome her to the meeting.
All right, so we just everybody tuned in at home. We just went through general fund and TRT, and we are now going to move into the capital reserve update. Before moving on to kind of what happened with the courthouse this year. So the capital reserve is used for all future debt service for the courthouse and our future capital needs, some of which Commissioner Bone just spoke about, as well as our capital maintenance. General fund revenue above our contingency policy, that 33%, is transferred into the capital reserve annually to support those capital needs as well as potentially operational needs if ever needed. We're projecting a $4.4 million transfer from the general fund to capital reserves at the end here of fiscal year 24, and TRT revenue greater than future obligations, as we've talked about, is also transferred to the capital reserve for future debt payments, capital operational needs if need be. Last year, we also,
TRT continues to nosedive. Does that mean you refunded?
if TRT continues to
That
nose,
would be
we have to have all the conversations you're talking about, Jim, in that case. So the LATC, the Local Assistance Tribal Confederated Funds, ARPA funds, the ARPA interest and the PILT contributions, we sent those all to the general reserve for debt buy down and future payments. Specifically, we sent those funds as a budget decision and then later as a board decision, once we realized we had the 15 million from the courthouse, to buy down the courthouse debt service. And we'll discuss that soon.
So both the ARPA buckets are done now, correct?
Correct.
And then, but PILT still, that's still a trickle that comes in.
Yep, PILT's the annual contribution. Right now it goes to the road and the service district. We did split the PILT last year and part of it went to paying down this courthouse.
Right. Okay.
So as Robert's, indicated here, the balance of the capital reserve and our reserves in general is a very strong indicator of the county's fiscal health. And really that's the reserve that we're looking at. We want to see that continue to grow and continue to be able to fund capital needs and operational needs. Capital reserve update. This graph right here is the actual ending funding balance. You can see we did pay, it did approach close to 12 million in fiscal year 19, and we paid for the North County building as well as some other buildings in cash. And then in FY23, it was depleted to almost $1.9 million. But there was a budget decision to move in about $3.5 million of TRT, transient room tax, which left it close to 6 million for fiscal year 23. The increase in fiscal year 24 is due to all those LATCF ARPA funds, the PILT and the other ARPA interests that we moved in here. And so basically there's $5.9 million of past and current year's general fund. So all of our general fund up until this point, we have just $6 million in there. We have $5 million of past and current year unallocated TRT over that's just the last 2 years. And then we have those ARPA funds we spoke about, and then we will be receiving, we have not received yet, but we will receive $15 million in state funds for the courthouse. And that will jump this balance up to 26.3 million. Actually, sorry, 31.3 million. And then we will have a $20 million buy down right then, which will reduce the ending balance to 11.3 million. And so that $20 million buy down we'll talk about more, but basically finance came to the commissioners with the options and with some analysis, and they chose the $20 million buy down to optimize kind of our fiscal health for the county.
And as a non-commissioner member of the budget committee, I thank the commissioners for making that decision.
Yes. And then the ending balance reserved for future debt service payments. Are there any questions on this graphic or anything about the capital reserve before we kind of head on to the forecast of the capital reserve? We're heading on to courthouse funding next, actually, before we go into capital reserve. So the courthouse funding, the estimate remains the same of 40.5 million plus some contingency. the commissioners did do a $20 million buy down, made possible by $15 million in state funding, which was an absolute blessing. Very thankful for that. This $20 million buy down saved approximately $12 million in interest costs over the life of the debt service versus no buy down. And so, last year when we were talking our budget and we're looking at how do we pull all this money, it was really almost decreasing appropriations from funds just to be able to make a 20-year debt service. And that state funding really has given us some marginal breathing room in that area. The county did issue the full faith and credit bond for $20.5 million. The true interest cost is 3.93%, significantly less than we had anticipated. We had anticipated closer to 4.6 for 20 years of annual debt service.
5.1 was mentioned at 1.2.
5.1.
That's excellent.
It was amazing. Yeah. So our annual debt service at 4.6 was $1.6 million, and now it's only 1.5. So we actually saved $2 million or $2.1 million by that lowering of the actual true interest cost. And that was really just luck. We went out right after the new inflation data came in, and the inflation rate just plummeted in that November. And so because of that, the interest rate plummeted as well. So that was great news for us. The annual debt service is projected to be funded by the transient room tax revenue, the remaining general fund revenue transfer to the county general reserve, and monitoring growth rate. And obviously, as I spoke to before in the TRT, we will continue to assess the TRT assumptions, because right now we are planning to pay for it with that 2.5% TRT revenue growth. If that ends up being flat for a time period, then we'll need to reassess other areas to make sure that we can cover the debt service.
And I might have misheard you. You said construction cost was 45 million, including contingency, or 45 million and an additional contingency?
40.5 million. And I think there's a 10% contingency built into.
Yeah, including contingency. Thank you.
Yes. All right. So on to the capital reserve forecast. And so this reserve level does not include major new capital projects. We've spoken a lot to that. But right here, what we're showing is that this particular reserve forecast is showing the reserve picking up the operational deficit in the general fund in fiscal year 35. So that's important. Sometimes we have presented in our long-term forecast without the reserve picking up the general fund operating, but because we continue to kind of see this historical general fund expenditure, we are in this case projecting that the excess TRT that goes to the capital reserve would have to pay for the general fund's operations deficit. Now, obviously, if we reduce expenditures or optimize revenue, and the general fund was balanced and we didn't eat into our contingency policy, then those TRT reserves wouldn't go to subsidize those operations. They would actually build in our reserve, and we would probably end up somewhere closer to $17 million in our TRT 20 plus years from now. That's our projection. If we could alleviate the general fund operations issue, and with our current TRT projections growing at 2.5, the other graph would show a $17 million reserve, which in 20 years is more like $10 or $11 million, which isn't that much on $1 billion plus budget at that point in time as a general county reserve. But I did just want to point this out, that this is showing us trying to work with the operations issue within the general fund, and how that TRT capital reserve would decrease.
That's the difference between the 5.5 and 4.8.
Yes.
We don't structurally fix that.
Correct.
Over time, this will just, it'll eat the whole thing.
Right. And so this is also showing why the TRT contributions are necessary for the future debt, new capital, and fiscal stability. And we'll update all this again for the April 29th meeting, where we can go over the long-term forecast and see if there's been any changes. But this is what we're projecting right now, if you were to keep the core services at the same level and not optimize your revenue. Right. So are there any questions on this forecast about any of that information? That's a lot of information.
What just comes to mind are the other variables out here. You know, the cost of a room is, I'm going on vacation, I'm spending X amount a night for the room, but going out to dinner is getting so expensive, and such a razor thin margin of profit for the food agencies. Then there's home delivery for food or just cooking, you know. So I mean, there's going to be variables in there still.
and this was the conversation I had yesterday with somebody, it's, you go out to dinner, it used to be, okay, we're gonna commit to, $150 for the 4 of us or the 6 of us. Now it's $300 and $400 and it's just not digestible. So I mean, these are variables that are out there still. And I mean, this graph basically until FY 32, you're seeing the general fund and TRT pour money into this reserve every year. And then as soon as you cross over into FY 33, you're no longer seeing any general fund contribution to it. And you're seeing TRT cover the negative general fund amount essentially.
And that's why we talk about looking at slowing the growth. That other graph, what can we do today to help prevent this drop off? This also does not include, as we talked about, all those major capital projects that we may want to do, right? It doesn't include any capital projects.
Right.
So if we did capital projects today or in the next 5 years, say, that take away this funding, then this graph just moves up sooner than later than where it is today. Or plan, goes negative sooner if we don't have the reserves or if we spend it sooner.
Well, and that's tricky because you could say, well, we could model in a capital project of X every some number of years. Then sometimes you convince yourself that you're committing yourself to a capital project that you may or may not actually want or need to do. So, I mean, you're laying it out this way, but if you then decide that you're going to add a campground or affordable housing unit or something in that range, that really changes, as you were saying, that really changes the curve there.
And this capital reserve forecast does project in some minor capital and the capital and maintenance needed for the current and projected to be growing, but it does not factor in any major capital improvements like the sheriff's office or even the clerk's office or building things that in the past we've been able to do. And so as Robert's speaking to that, unless there's any more questions, I was going to talk about some of the operational needs that we see on the horizon too that could affect this capital forecast that we don't necessarily have within our capital reserve forecast. And so there's increased growth and funding changes can cause financial instabilities to departments. And I think one of the major conversations this budget cycle will likely be the sheriff's office department. The beginning working capital did come in lower than projected, but it's also come in lower than projected for the last few years, despite the tax increases at this point in time. So they are below their contingency policy, and there's cash flow associated with that, cash flow issues associated with that. And finance is actively working with the sheriff's office right now to look for solutions both on the revenue and the expenditure side, because it is an issue where we will need to discuss that and look at that and see how to present a balanced budget, given the fact that you are at a maxed tax levy right now. The sheriff's office in their budget, even with the max tax levy, projected to decrease beginning working capital another 4 million by the end of this year. Now, I don't think they'll actually land 4 million under, but when you only have 9 million in beginning or 11 million in beginning working capital, and you lose another 4 in the contingency policy, 17 million for cash flow issues. That's just, we kind of need a reset either on the revenue or the expenditure side. And like I said, finance is working with the sheriff's office to identify solutions. I think we're making a lot of progress, but one of the questions that I actually have for this group is typically the sheriff's office hasn't presented in April, and the late April meeting, which is the pre-budget meeting that we've done for health services. But one of the questions is, given the fact that this is very large, our second largest operational budget, would folks want to hear from the sheriff's office this year pre-budget week to hear about kind of the solutions that they're coming up with for their long-term forecast and balancing their budget in the coming year? So that's just
Important department. I think we should hear from them.
And just to interrupt real quick, I should say that meeting is already scheduled from 11 to 5, and it includes health services, Covo Echo, which was part of the survey results, and the long-term forecast. So we would need to, that's just a commitment to make that meeting 10 to 5 now. So yeah, if the extra hour, now we're talking a long time. Yeah,
That means
yeah,
we didn't say 11 to 11.
yeah. And there's the elected officials compensation on that meeting as well. So it's a big meeting. Right.
At that meeting, we might have to elect a new chair.
at least a temporary.
Oh, I would like to make a comment about the sheriff's office. I remember that the Forest Service said the sheriff's office is really a part of what's going on in China Hat. And of course, I'm sure you saw the latest emails out of China Hat and what is going on there. That's only getting worse. So I know it's a big drag on our sheriff's office because they're part of trying to stabilize what is going on there. And it seems pretty horrific at this moment in time from what I'm seeing.
I mean, it sounds like from what you were saying and from what I've seen otherwise, it sounds like really understanding some of their solutions for cash flow would at least be a pretty good component for them to be able to describe early. So that we can understand, is there relaxation that we could do in beginning, or that they could do in beginning capital? I'm not for that, but you know, is that maybe a solution for them to try and promote? But overall, just getting an understanding of where their capital and where their materials and services are flowing. And then, you know, I think we can, it's pretty easy to project where, I shouldn't say pretty easy. It's a pretty good bet that the next contracts that everybody's doing are going to be pretty contentious. And so you're going to model in some pretty strong personnel growth all the way around. So understanding how they are more effective in terms of some of their materials and services decisions, that might be a really good use of some extra time on April 29th.
Yeah, and we're not forecasting the sheriff's office to, you know, kind of come back up without some kind of reset on the revenue or expenditure side. So that would be why, you know, to kind of brief the committee before the budget week on some of those things, if you feel that's important. But if not, we can, I guess a vote or something would be good to know. If not, we can just continue with the current schedule, which is health services, EDCO, COVO, elected compensation, and long-term forecast, which covers general fund and TRT.
I support taking a look at this. I mean, just to understand the structural variables that could be, you know, on the table. So yeah, we should take some time and look at
Anybody
it.
that doesn't think that's valuable?
I think it's valuable. One consideration is that the sheriff's office, the election for sheriff is in May. It's actually going to fall during budget week, May 21st. And this is April 29th is just a few weeks before that. So this, particularly if questions of business ability, financial management are part of the debates among candidates for the sheriff, we could experience a little bit of political theater at this during this discussion. So that would be one reason to consider not having it, but it is a very important topic. It's stuff that we want to discuss in advance. I do think we want to have a good handle on some of these things in advance of budget week. So,
Well, and I support that. I mean, yeah, I'm not looking for political theater at this, but this is the budget. This is the authority of the Board of Commissioners and the Budget Committee also. So, just with knowing that and having full vision on it, we need to talk about it.
Okay, yeah, politics is politics and all the
Yeah.
rest. I would hope that, county organizations are mature enough to know not to campaign from the presentation podium in a public meeting in uniform. But if that's a message that needs to be reinforced, I think we can, or at least I think county council could.
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea would be similar to our health service presentation, just a presentation on what the gap is and how do we balance the budget and some of the ideas that they might have. So fairly finance oriented, and certainly I think everybody can take a look at the presentation materials and ensure that. So all right, so we will do that, and then we'll send out a calendar invite for 10 to 5 now for that meeting on April 29th.
2.5 of us.
9 to 5 now.
Isn't it? Because the
Compensation committee.
Oh, maybe it is 9 to 5. I thought we had scheduled for 11 to 5 and then I was thinking another hour, but 9 to 5.
An hour for the sheriff and then compensations move back to. 9,
Okay, 9 to 5.
Right?
We'll make a day of it.
Yeah, get some snacks.
Really
She'll
good.
sleep in that day.
Yeah, okay.
They'll be thinking of us.
No, it's good. We have significant operational capital conversations and this, hopefully, this is also in hopes that we can then kind of trim down some of the actual budget week conversations if everybody's already understanding what the major issues are. So community development is another place where there's been some financial instability. As you'll see on the upcoming slide, they are relying on permit activity and they did lay off 4 staff members due to decreased permit activity. They also eliminated, I believe, 6 positions and maybe froze some others. I'm conscious that our budget officer here knows a lot more about this than me, but they are struggling. And on the next slide, we'll kind of look at their CDD revenues. Public health, as we explained, is funded differently than behavioral health. We always need to look at them to see the kind of support that they need, along with adult parole and probation. As Commissioner Chang actually spoke to today, there have been some impacts to their major funding source, which is capitation in adult parole and probation, and they're projecting it to decline over the next couple of years, which could potentially end up being a need for more general fund resources if they're going to provide the same level of parole and probation services. Because they are predominantly funded out of capitation. There isn't really a fee for service or other kind of revenue there. Although I do know that they're working very hard to try and see if there's any grant revenue that they can procure. Community justice juvenile, we always put them on here too, because they have $6.8 million transfer in general funds. So those transfers are just very large. And as we look at them increasing year over year, we just need to be cognizant. In the justice court, justice court's fees don't cover it, so it's typically covered out of transient room tax as opposed to general fund. But it's something to kind of continue to look at as that transfer has grown. Some things that are not in the forecast we kind of spoke about, but there's an upcoming salary study with market review. Not to be confused with class and compensation, but a salary study. There's future PERS.
Kathy has any comments about?
Just that the RFP is out now, and we expect those to come in, actually the end of this week, those bids. And so we'll see kind of what we're expecting in terms of, that initial impact for just the study. And then there's the additional work of, forecasting an impact of what salary study might, do to personnel costs.
And do you want to mention the limited
Sure.
scope of the
Yeah,
project?
why we're not allowed to say things like classic comp study, right? So a few years ago, the county, and in fact, I think in 2017 or 18 is when it was implemented, I think in 18. The county did a classification and compensation review, which is where we looked at what each employee does and their classification, and then did a market study on the salary for that. This is a different scope. This scope is really doing a market analysis to determine if we're competitive with our wages. So it's removing that classification piece. So it's really just that testing the market, seeing where we are and where if we're competitive. It will also require us to review who we define as market. So it's been of input from departments, various folks asking us to reevaluate that. So it's really looking at that market component, internal equity, as we have moved away from, time has gone by since that initial study. Do we still have that same equity, or do we need to make any adjustments? Also, because as we have evaluated different bargaining groups, and we've seen compression in some of those areas because this study is specific to our non-represented or AFSCME folks who have not had their wages evaluated since that initial study, where some of our smaller bargaining units, we have looked at those more frequently. The other piece is that it will include that equity component to it as well. So kind of quite a few deliverables that we'll expect from them. It's a different scope of work than we have seen in the past on us approaching this.
it's, if I understand correctly, it's probably 700 of our 1,200 employees. If ASME's about
Mhm.
570 and then the non-reps.
Yeah,
It's
impressive.
just a ballpark.
Yeah.
I'm just guessing.
Yes,
That's about it.
I know.
Just to give you a magnitude of.
Into ballpark on top of that ballpark, if general fund is 18 million in personnel, plus probably roughly 15 million in transfers out to departments, about 33 million in personnel. If you take about 60% of that, we'll just say 20 million of those people, 20 million of those dollars are eligible. If you see a 10% increase for those folks or five, that's, it's $2 million right there. So that's where we're talking about kind of a personnel reset that would then continue going forward. So.
And is it purely wage salary based, or are you also looking at some of the more intangible T-comp type of measures?
We have, in the RFP, we have asked for folks to present how they would approach that. In the past, we've considered some of those variables, but it really depends on who we define as our comparable markets, if that is of a big impact, right? If we only use public sector, other counties, the biggest difference is things like, do you pay the 6% on the PERS or not, right? But otherwise, there's not going to be a huge component or difference in how we provide those benefits as wages.
Okay.
Good. Including operational needs, we expect the biennial rates of PERS are ending, so we'll get some new PERS rates here at some point. We expect that to be about a 1.5% increase. That's what the latest numbers from Millman, the actuaries, say. As Commissioner Chang alluded to, something like PERS would be included in those assumptions. We've seen that before. Something that wouldn't be included would be the increased health insurance rates and indirect costs. We just haven't really raised those until this fiscal year. We do, and we'll talk about that more, but we do plan to have to raise health insurance rates again in FY25 to be able to cover kind of minimum reserve policies and cover the claims costs in the health insurance fund at this point in time. Those costs, well, we'll talk about it more, but those costs have just increased dramatically, and we just need to align those. Moving forward, we have CDD development revenues, and this is, we spoke to the 4 layoffs and the 6 positions that were eliminated. So we want to put in a slide kind of looking at the revenues. You can see the percent change as that orange, and it's down over 12.1% in FY24 application volume decrease. And so that just kind of speaks to the variability of a fund like CDD and the permitting volumes.
So now, was this just a general reduction in services without actually shifting any of the services, or did you remove services from what you do in this space? I think it's more the former.
They didn't remove any services.
They didn't remove
It was
any
just
service.
reducing permitting staff that.
Right. So
and a lot of the reduction was in the vacant positions. That was, this shows reduction of 4 FTE, but I think they've gone from 72 to 48 and only 4 layoffs. All the others have been through attrition, departures and then just eliminating vacant positions.
I mean, it's neutral news, not good news, but at least you do that. Now, we have some historical from the last, recession. How fast can the department actually rebound if the market suddenly swings?
Well, yeah, that's a good question. Peter thinks that they've actually stabilized even over the last month or so, a couple months. And speaking with my colleagues with the cities of Bend and Redmond, they have as well. And everybody has some concerns going forward, just not with so many unknowns, but everybody feels pretty stable with where they're at right now. Now, if it takes off, for example, rural ADUs, there's a whole influx of it's challenging in our region. It's challenging to find particularly building inspectors and plan reviewers, just so few available. There's a few more planners around, but not a lot. So it's tough. It's very challenging to rebound quickly.
Well, and we're sorry, were you going to say something? Because one of the issues that you might run into is as you reduce that, what you do is you get really good at doing what you do, but you don't actually go try and figure out any of the innovative things that are going on. So now when an ADU comes out or new types of permitting come out or anything else in that space, the organization is stuck doing what it's good at doing. So that actually limits innovation in this case in building and permitting.
So it's I mean, there's no easy way to say, well, shoot, just keep them on and let them be bored and try and figure things out. That's not the right answer. But there is a warning that says you're actually stagnating a lot of future opportunity as a result of trying to cut to the bone. And that's again, something we're gonna have to think about in other departments. This is just a good bellwether for you.
Along those lines, I was gonna ask whether. So none of the staff squeezing has been in non-application related divisions like code compliance or long-range planning or things like that.
So it had, so code compliance, for example, has reduced from 5 to 3. Again, through attrition, they left. And I think they lost one long-range plan. Well, Peter Russell, for example, retired, and then Tarek Rawlings, long-range planner, has moved to that position. So that's how they've continued to make ends meet, with existing staffing through attrition. So not to say that there's not a reduction in service. Tomorrow, for example, the board will hear from the Community Development Department's long-range planning team to find out what projects to undertake next. But, it's not as robust of a staff, so that can't be as ambitious of a going forward. And so when it comes to code compliance, there could be impacts. And I've asked Peter to share those potential impacts with the board going forward, what it looks like with 3 code enforcement technicians as opposed to 5.
And I mean, just to speak to the, continuing to invest in things that generate revenue. I mean, without some of this long-term planning work, without code compliance that's maintaining our quality of life, our growth opportunities are diminished. And if our growth opportunities are diminished, then we're not going to continue that high level of assessed valuation growth that we've seen for a number of years now either. So it's
or when you're looking for that extra growth, it's like, oh, okay, I just pulled in a bunch of land in the UGB, or I just found a way to be able to develop. I don't have the ability to develop it fast enough to reap the reward.
Yeah.
I mean, all of this gets very vicious from a cycle point.
Yeah.
And I would actually just maybe add to that a little bit in that working with CDD on this, it was not in kind of a reactive or acute moment, right? These have been conversations that have gone on. In fact, I think those 6 positions were eliminated at some time ago, and that this is something that they've been sort of seeing for a while. And so it's more of a right sizing than it is a reaction to an immediate loss of revenue. And I think good point there, because that was part of our discussion, was how can we be prepared for when we see that uptick. And one example is that it had been difficult for us to find building inspectors. And so there's a little bit of a grow your own. And so investing in someone without all of the certifications, keeping them on to obtain those certifications so that when and if we're able to respond with that. So yeah, absolutely. Those discussions are occurring.
I mean, it's a good methodology to make sure you have, because there's probably several other again, I said that if this is the bellwether, there's probably several other organizations that are going to go through it. You're going to want those BKMs to be able to walk them through.
But yesterday at the leadership summit, once again, the governor's up there saying we need to build houses. Well, you have a policy. I want to build, tens of thousands, 36,000 or whatever the number is. And then the Derek Thompson is from the Atlantic. He was kind of their keynote speaker person. They did an interview session between him and the governor, and he said, well, if you look at the big picture in Oregon, ever since the 80s, every decade, we've been building less and less houses in the state of Oregon. And what do you say to that? And she says, well, we outlawed single family zoning and this and that, but it's still in that. So this is my comment, still in that same box of the state land use system that just limits. It just does. So, there's bigger picture items here also. So, and I know,
I have a different perspective.
Yeah, exactly. The governor, you would have. Yep.
Well, one thing that's
We don't
helpful
need
with
to
the
go over.
ADUs is I've heard that if there's 2 plans, you pick from one, you can get an expedited review. So I mean, that's something other counties and municipalities are talking about.
Yeah, I mean.
That reduce costs, right?
The city of Bend has pre-approved ADU designs.
A template that you can put in.
Yeah.
when we did authorize accessory dwelling units. In fact, does anybody know, has any other county done that yet? Or are we the first ones that took up the ADUs in rural?
I think a couple have.
Yeah, so I haven't heard about any other activity. So that'll be interesting to see what those numbers do. Maybe that will be a moment where people really start to build some of those.
And there are ways that we could be helping some of our residents and property owners navigate the state land use planning system to get them to the development that will then generate property taxes faster than they are. You know, the legacy, those legacy, there's a couple of areas around the county that were, you know, the lots are pretty small. And they were laid out at a time when clearly the intention was for them to be, you know, small, you know,
Single family home.
small subdivisions, but then they were put into resource zoning. We could actually be helping those landowners by doing something like, you know, blanket soil surveys instead of making each one pay $15,000 for a soil survey. To get them to development of what pretty much everyone agrees they should be allowed to develop out as homes. And then those could be, you know, full homes on our tax bases instead of small 3-acre pieces of bare land. So there's definitely things that we could be doing to actually help people get to get to the homes that they want to build faster than we are.
And that's where the philosophy, you know, we could get out of the way too, instead of stepping in. But that's.
One thing I'll point out on a financial aspect that I want to point out for CDD, because I think it's a lesson for all our funds, all our departments, and ourselves in the general fund, is, to Kathleen's point, they saw the forecast and the permitting volumes, and they had this plan with their FTEs, so they didn't have to have a mass reduction in their staff. They're looking at the reserves, they're watching their expenditures. So when they saw this decreased revenue, they also looked at what M&S could they reduce, where do we not fill the positions, so they looked at this all holistically. But they also had their reserves to help weather this. Now, they haven't had to dig into it as much yet, and so we're thankful for that, right? But that's what the reserves are for. So when we translate, just the slide before, we were talking about other operational needs, other operational departments. That's one thing we need to look at during, through the upcoming budget season. What are the contingency levels? What are the reserves that we have for some of these funds? And again, we'll hear from the sheriff's office what their plans are for their contingency, how to bring that up to level. Again, a contingency is used for, you need it, one, for the cash flows, because your fiscal year starts and your cash runs out. If you don't have a reserve, a contingency, then you can't pay those costs till your new revenues come in November. Or if there's other expenditures that come up through the year, that's why you have a contingency. And finally, if you have to make that adjustment for that marginal beginning working capital, the difference between one year you budget and the next, that comes out of your contingency as well. Beyond that is reserves, because if you don't have the cash and an emergency response happen, you also need a reserve. So we will be looking at that and talking about that more during the upcoming budget season. And when we're making some of those decisions, we may remind the budget committee about that. Last year, the budget committee did approve added expenditures out of the sheriff's office rural district, which was a good decision there. However, they did have to reduce their contingency to pay for those extra costs, which then their contingency was lower anyway. So we may provide additional guidance and information to the budget committee during those times, so you just make informed decisions in that area. So we'll try to highlight those a little more for you throughout the year. But again, we just want to stress reserves, contingency, and the importance, because again, if we could help that future cliff or avoid a cliff at all, we'll be helping to try to point that out and provide the information to the budget committee.
Thank you, Robert. Other future county capital needs. So, county operations continue to grow and future capital projects may be necessary. Preliminary new capital conversations include the expansion of the clerk's office, which Commissioner DeBonne spoke to briefly. The public safety campus, which Commissioner DeBonne, I think, also spoke to.
Those are the two that are in my head. Yeah.
Yeah, those are the two largest right now. Of course, when we do have conversations about unallocated TRT, then that's when, Jeff, as the fair director, will talk about the fair capital plan. And it sounds like we want to see that capital plan in more detail this year, so we can make as much as an informed decision as possible on that. So we'll ask for that as well. But the fair.
Go ahead, sorry.
Oh, I was just saying that's a large capital maintenance and capital expansion plan as well in the future.
There's a capital plan for need, like the clerk's office. I'm just as a citizen, I'm impressed that they can pull off the vote counting and all the other things that they do in the space that they have, and I give them a ton of credit. There's then also capital need for revenue or other things like that, and I think that's more of a fairgrounds discussion of it doesn't come down purely into an ROI discussion, but some of it is investment to function. Some of it is investment for ROI, and it's really an understanding in an investment from ROI perspective, especially if it truly is ROI like that, like the county. Are we then making an impact on other public or other private industry as a result? So I think there's a lot to balance back and forth on that. But just seeing a plan and saying, okay, here's what the plan would look like. Okay, if I start sliding that in time, yes, my revenue or my requirements are going to go up if I push it out 5 years. But is the deferred revenue for 5 years, an acceptable trade-off to do that? So I think it's just worthwhile if you were coming in just to put the right lens on what we're looking at.
And of course, there's with every new FTE, there's some amount that is attached to a future capital plan, right? It's not like an FTE is just a vacuum of personnel and materials and services cost. Every 20 or so people, you need a new space. So that's a reality too, as the county continues to grow. So if financially viable capital projects are projected to be funded through unallocated TRT, mostly because our general fund is projected to be, utilized for operations. So that just leaves kind of transient room tax as our discretionary funding source for capital projects. Also, some of the capital maintenance fund, 3% or 3 cents in property tax goes to the capital maintenance fund 070 for capital maintenance. And that used to be enough. However, as the county expands and gets larger, they have also needed a transfer from county reserve funds every year to be able to provide the level of county maintenance that's a kind of a necessary standard. So,
has there been a discussion on whether that needs to grow? Whether that transfer needs to increase?
It did increase last year. We, as part of the proposed budget, it increased it. Yeah, it wasn't an explicit conversation, but we did. I mean, it was just necessary to make sure that facilities could do the capital maintenance, so it grew.
There's a maintenance aspect, and then there's a reserve replacement aspect. And I know reserve replacement is generally pushed back on the departments that have the big reserve replacement spaces, but that is something where additional planning can actually tell you where you're going to see, a massive canyon that you need to jump, because there's some pretty expensive things that the county owns.
So moving on to the County Health Benefits Trust, I'm going to do a general overview. We're blessed to have Kathleen here. So if you have any specific details, she might be able to answer those. So this graph just shows the ending balance. And then of course it shows the claims rising, the claims cost rising there. And our county strategy was to subsidize premiums, to spend down the reserves, as we've talked about the last couple of years, to align with policy of $8 million. We're talking about that was in effect FY19 when we were up at $15 million, $16 million. But the pent-up demand with COVID-19 plus the inflation plus some other factors in terms of insurance claims just led this to drop probably even faster than we expected. And we're now sitting about $5 million, which is frankly, probably that reserve level is not adequate for the Health Benefits Trust, which is part of the reason why we'll need to raise departmental rates again. And finance has been working with HR manages this fund, and finance has been working with them to look at how do we raise the rates to have a flat and just marginally increasing reserve level to cover those claims percentage as best as possible. So we're not going all over the place. Of course, this is a highly variable fund with a lot of different factors, but we think that we've come up with some numbers that will help us with that. When we look at this next slide, we did.
Just a quick question with, the claims rate was probably moderately explainable to the fact that, everybody's starting to come back now and there's a comfort level in it, but we're continuing to see a pretty sharp rise. Is there something specific that's coming in that, or is it just in general, we're seeing more of a groundswell of medical need?
So the 21 to 22, we had two things occurring. We had one huge claim on big sky, and then we also had that increase. So I think that the additional that you're seeing in 22 on that angle is more representative of the increase that we're seeing generally in terms of the healthcare costs. But that spike is really around the costs associated with that one big claim and then some of those additional ones. The other piece that came on there is that we did bring on our new vendor at the on-site clinic. And there were some additional costs and implementation to bring that vendor on. So again, it was, I think, as we talked about that perfect storm or that crescendo, that was also the year, in 21, where there was a lot of discussion about whether or not we should increase the cost to departments or if we should delay that, because we had sort of been subsidizing, right, with the reserve, the actual cost of health insurance with the departments. And there was a discussion about should we wait one more year or start a slow increase. And the decision was at that point with finance and admin at the time was to just wait one more year. It wasn't the good year to wait in hindsight. So it was that continuing to subsidize one more year, the increase in those that particular high cost claim, additional increase in claims, and then what we're seeing in terms of just utilization and cost of the healthcare itself.
The healthcare inflation was even greater than the regular inflation that we saw
Right.
elsewhere, and we certainly see that in the claims costs. So we raised departmental rates by 29.35% in FY24, and then just verbally say it, our model estimates that we'll need to raise it by 15%, at least 15% next year, and then a marginal amount the year after. But again, we are also actively looking at the balance right now and estimating the projected ending balance to see if there's significant deviations this year from what we're projecting, because that would change. So it's kind of a fluid situation. We'll certainly know more in the coming months, but there is also like a 2-month lag with insurance claims, health insurance claims. So it's difficult to quite know where we're going to end until we are a little bit farther along in the process.
Oh, I just want to make a comment. Excuse me, it's Commissioner Adair. Yes, and remember there was a note in our financial statement from Moss Adams regarding the fact that now our health benefit fund balance has gone down excessively. And honestly, I think we should have done something sooner rather than later. And I'm really wondering if what you're saying, 15% for this next year. Anyway, we've got to do something, because it wouldn't take much to just eliminate that whole fund with the way healthcare costs have risen in the last couple of years.
Right. Yeah. And so, like I said, we're monitoring it. And certainly if we see larger claim spikes or claims costs coming in higher than we're already projecting, which is a possibility, it's happened in the last couple of years, then we would need to increase that health insurance claim rate from 15%, which was what we were expecting next year, to a higher rate. We have a pretty comprehensive model there. I think we're just waiting to see as this year goes on to see where the claims costs are going to land. But right now, based on where they're landing, we think 15%. And we're happy to share that model and what that would look like with the stabilization outgoing and some of the assumptions that we have going into there. We do use historical assumptions that are looking at the last several years as well. So
And I think when we looked at that modeling, the 15%, we ended up with a 8 million or over, a little over 8 million.
8 million and growing, yeah.
Right. And then growing it regularly. So that is the goal and current policy.
Right. And to address Commissioner Dare's concern, we have, I mean, finance and HR have talked about amending or updating that policy to be explicit that the reserve level needs to be a certain percentage of the claims cost, so that it is not a flat 8 million, so that that claims cost is growing every year. And that policy has a few things. It's not a flat policy, but there might just be another way that we can word it to explicitly make sure that we are in compliance with that, I think. Rates did increase from 90 to 95 for employee only and 90 to 116 for employee plus dependents. And that was on January 1st, 2024. That'll go into effect. The last increase was in 2016. And in the light blue bar, you can see the department increase, which was that 29.35%. Health benefits assumptions. So this is actually our forecast, and there's a lot of different inputs and outputs, including the specific claims type, prescription versus pharmacy, those kind of things. We look at historicals and we take those historical models and we try to do a conservative estimate, which means increase the expenditures. And then we look at our revenue. The revenue portion is fairly easy because it's just this charge, right? The premium charge. And this is kind of what we've come up with right now for the rates needing to increase 15% in fiscal year 25 to build the reserve to an adequate level. So you can see that we're projecting that we lose again about another million plus, and we go down to 5 million in ending fund balance, but then we jump up to somewhere around 7.5 and then around 9 million eventually, and it kind of continually grows. But that was what I was talking about, where we need to really continue to assess claims, because if claims do, like they did last year, come in much higher at the end of the year, then this number, this 15%, will need to jump up significantly. So I think that's where finance and HR are pretty continually meeting to make sure that we're still around this estimated area.
I know conforming plans make it pretty difficult, but is there any option that you can do around actually studying reduction in services and therefore reduction in overall costs?
Reduction in plan services? Or...
Yeah, so that is something that we can look at. And we have looked at it in the past, and we actually have done some adjustments. There's a couple of projects planned. One of the big ones is really our pharmacy benefit. That's where we're seeing an increase in our costs, and then specialty drugs, for example, they're having the largest percent increase. And so we plan for next year will be an RFP for those services, as we have evaluated our existing formulary and those costs. We would expect to see some savings from moving to a new PBM. There is huge disruption to membership at that moment. And so it's something we're only interested in doing or doing it all at one time, right? So we can adjust the formulary now, see a little bit of savings, but because of that big disruption, our plan is to just majorly disrupt next year one time and see some savings from that. It is those types of pieces that we're working with our consultant to evaluate where we can see those savings.
Well, and it's an intangible. I mean, you health insurance is kind of an assumed thing, and when you start to make even semi-significant changes in it, it's a significant disturbance in the force for that person and the family involved.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when people who are potentially loose or could look for different things go, oh, okay, this is an intangible shift that makes me worry and I'm going to jump. So it's not a thing to really mess with if you don't have to, but at the same time, the rate increases are doing a very similar thing. It's, even if you start to say, well, modestly, it's only, a cup of coffee a month or something like that, that does start to impact when all the other costs are rising around them. And again, it's an opportunity for people whose comfort level is already bad to jump, and that almost the good people are the ones that leave because they can, and that starts to make you worry.
It is, and I'll say that the practice. The county hadn't increased employee costs in 10 years, I think. And so I think that, even though the cost I think was minimal and we went through, I mean, it's an impact, it's there, but it could have been, I think, a lot bigger. Just the idea of that cost change, right? And so that working with employees on that mindset, I think was a big hurdle to get through. And probably something that we're going to see regularly now, which is what most employers experience, is some nominal increase, right? And so we currently have a percentage situation, and the idea is to continue to work and maintain that percentage. So I'm hoping that that's more of a something that can be digested more easily over time versus these cliffs that someone experienced, having not had an increase in their employee rate in 10 years to now having one, right?
And Jim, to that point, I came out of private enterprise last year, and that was kind of the expectation in the private world, is that there would be an annual increase to premiums. And I think anybody that has a significant other or spouse that is enrolled in a private plan, they're seeing that same thing on that end. And I think we just need to be maybe more in tune to that and understand that we've got to obviously provide a benefit here, but there is a definite cost involved, and we may not be able to provide, quite the same benefit going forward, or at a much higher cost than what we've seen in the past.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, if somebody's staring at this versus a private industry plan, they're winning big.
Yeah.
And so that's a nice thing to keep. But that can shift really quickly.
In the past, it was hard to sell increase in benefit costs because we had such an increase in reserve. So that put it off for a long
We're
time.
done with that one.
We argued the point at the time, that we should probably have more frequent increases, but that's why we didn't.
Well, and given kind of the conversation today and everybody interested in this reserve level, I think we can come back with an updated reserve update for the long-term forecast and on April 29th and just make sure that we're still trending in that same direction. So. All right, county FTE update. Black line is the vacancy. It's doubled since about 2020. And it remains pretty high at about 11%. And then the blue bar is the FTE. The overall county FTE has decreased by 3%, obviously, or 3 positions, three FTE. There's been some increase in some places and decreases in others, substantially in community development, probably lowers that. So.
You also have statistics on length of time of vacancy. So how long's the rec been open?
Right. Not off the top of my head, but we do look at that. And there are quite a few vacancies that are not posted, right? Or some of them, quite a few of them are in the sheriff's office, for instance, which that's it's a 6-month process, right? And so it's maybe only ever posted once or twice a year. So there are some anomalies to that vacancy. For instance, I know in HR, we had a position that we were recruiting for, but we took some time to define the position and identify exactly what we wanted before we went out. So there was some space before we even posted the position, let alone count that rec fill time. Yeah.
Well, and that to me is good management. If you say I want to define the position that I want, and then I'm going to hire slow so that I get the right candidate, that's something that you should be rewarded. And I know, especially Bill and I coming from the private industry, counterintuitively, sometimes that's not. But then there's also the aspect of, I think I know what I want and I'm going to put out the rack and it's sitting there. And those are the ones that make me nervous, because it's either, if it's sitting there for long, it's either an undesirable position, the salary is wrong, or something else is wrong. And those are the ones where you say, okay, I might let you keep the FTE, but I'm telling you to pull the rack, and I'm resolving back through finance that no, I'm actually not asking for that position to be filled in this calendar year, or for at least for 6 months. And so take 6 months of my FTE time away. That gives you a better cost estimate into your organization, but then it also gives you the ability to then really think what you want the organization to be. the flip side of that for any of the organizations is now I've got unfilled racks, and again, the work is not getting done, and I'm stressing, causing overtime on my employees and all the rest. So there's a balance, but I think there could be a message back that says, really start to think about how you can reorganize around what you have plus what you could get, and take some time to do that and build that into the budget to actually see if there's some savings that could be recouped out of it. Don't measure just the raw FTEs, measure the FTEs that you're actually planning to employ in that given time.
Mhm.
It's a little more complex from a finance standpoint.
Okay. So on to the next slide, we have the FTE addition slide. And so this addition increase is from the mid-year, I believe, is what we're looking at, because although we've decreased from the FY24 total by 3, we've had an FTE addition since mid-year. Is that correct? Of 16.45.
So basically, we started this fiscal year, our adopted legal FTE was 1,252. And we've added a net of negative 2.80. Because we've reduced positions in CDD, we've added some in health, but the net impact is we reduced 2.80. And now we're at the 1,248.6.
Gotcha. Okay. Thank you, Cam. And so this FTE additions by department, the graph is basically just to look at where we've decreased or added FTE throughout the fiscal years. Fiscal year 24, obviously solid waste came to the budget with a lot of special requests, and those are reflected here as those were budget committee decisions as they grow their solid waste operations. Same with Fair and Expo in the sheriff's office. And so, yeah, I mean, we always need FTE to meet the growing service demands, and that's part of the budget committee process as we look at special requests every year. So cost of living adjustments, it's to be determined for FY25. It's based on a 12-month average. As of January 31st, 2024, actually our new bargaining unit is based off the average of the 12-month average off the CPI West. And you could see over the last couple of years, fiscal year 22, 23, and 24, we've really had a much higher actual CPI that's been maxed out at our COLA bargaining unit because our bargaining grades do have minimum and maximums. And so the last few years we've maxed out, along with, as Commissioner Chang spoke to, a 2% increase, I believe, in FY23 for individuals due to the impacts of inflation that year. So labor contracts do range from 1% to 4% increase. Those are the min and max. And what we're looking at right now, as we take a look at it, is probably trending slightly underneath that 4%. Inflation does
So
seem to be
Dan,
going.
excuse me, it's Commissioner Adair. How can you say the average CPI from February of 24 to October of 24 is 4.2? Aren't you talking about 23?
So what we're talking about is actually based on the bargain, as I understand it, is based off the bargaining or the union negotiation contract. Oh, yes, no, that's a typo. Yes, you're right. It would be February 2022 to October 23.
Okay,
No,
thank you.
February 23, excuse me, through October 23. Yes.
Okay.
2030 was a good year, but I didn't think that was where you were going.
No, I was going to go into all the details of it and explain, and then I realized, no, it's just a typo. Thank you, Commissioner Adair.
We live in the future in budget.
Yeah, we do live in the future. Speaking of the future, though, right now we are trending at 4.2, but the last kind of year over year that we've seen has been down 3.7, 3.5. The way we do the bargaining grade is slightly different than that, taking an average of all those, but we expect it to be slightly under 4% at this point. It could be 4%, the max grade, or it could be somewhere close to 3.5.
So when you say the labor contracts range, that's the CPI range, not the merit range.
Yes, that would be the CPI range. The merit range is the 5% steps that we have, and some departments, some bargainings have more steps than others per se.
And I just think that just as an FYI, we are not bargaining any contracts. So what we have is a known quantity, which is kind of nice. think for a while now, for about 2 years, I think. So it'll be nice for planning purposes.
When's your next significant CBA?
We actually have 4 all at once.
Yay.
Not an ideal situation. And that's in 2 years.
Okay.
Maybe we're at 1.5 years. Yeah. Yeah, we'll just pretend it's 2.
So when we talk about COLA, I mean, that's a huge factor in our overall personnel costs. And so we're looking at about 3.5. Onto the PERS outlook, it's a biennial rate cycle. Rates for FY25 will remain the same as FY24. It's the last year in the biennial rate cycle. 2023 to 2025 rates increased an average of 1.6%. Due to lower investment returns, the next PERS biennium is anticipated to have slightly higher rates, about 1.5 to 2%. But like I said, the most accurate and the last number that we heard was 1.5% from the actuaries about a week ago. And so that's kind of what we are forecasting for the next biennial rates. And we have put those in our personnel model as well for future years.
I think just one comment on that. So there's a legislative change. So our district attorneys did move into the police and fire category. So those costs will be going up. And I would not be surprised if in this legislative session that we see at least a request for our 911 dispatchers to also be included in that. We've kind of seen that historically.
So I'd push them into tier 2.
They would remain in whatever tier, but they would go into the police and fire, which has a higher, cost to it. Yeah.
So just a little bit more detail on the FY25 PERS rate. It is the second year of the biennial rate. We did expect this. We've been forecasting this PERS increase. We did plan accordingly. Rates below, these are just the specific rates. They do include the pickup of 6% and debt service of 1.5%. And we'll continue to monitor the PERS conversations to make sure that our PERS projections for the future are as accurate as possible. Right. Moving on to the American Rescue Plan Act. As we know, that was funded, the State and Local Fiscal Recovery Fund from the ARPA. American Rescue Plan Act was the largest, kind of federal grants to local governments. We received $38.4 million, and we have expended 29.5 of those, actually 29.6, possibly more at this point. And we have allocated all of the funds at this point in time. And here is how those allocations look. And so we've done a lot of great work. I know that there's an effort to, talk about the great work that's been done with the American Rescue Plan Act and the funding that's been predominantly sent back to the community. I've said this before, but a lot of agencies like ours use it to fund things internally. But we did use it to fund homelessness, affordable housing, COVID response, and did a lot of great work in the community. So.
And do you actually think everything that's allocated is on track to get spent on the timeline that it's set?
We do. Our ARPA manager, Laura's back there, and so we did. In fact,
so the spigot's off. It's all left for the drips.
The spigot is off. Yeah. In July, Laura and Robert came before the board, and there were some funds that came back. Folks weren't able to go through with those projects, and then they were reallocated out.
Well, it's also fair to say the spigot's off, but the request continues to come.
Yeah. Okay, so that's kind of the end of the financial update per se. Any questions about the general financial update, state of the county fiscal wide, before we kind of move on to the updates to the budget process and conclude with the budget calendar?
Thank you very much for the professional, representation of where we're at and where we need to go. As I say, understanding the 4.8 to the 5.5 and how we dial that in and for 10 and 20 years from now is so valuable. So thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you. All right, so budgets. Last year, one of the things Robert brought over here was we definitely need to send out a budget survey to the budget committee, citizens, and the board and see what their responses are. You guys were really nice to us. Appreciate it. Folks had a couple comments. Mostly I felt like the process was good, more than satisfactory, a good process, very effective. I would say the two largest things were that folks did want to hear from EDCO and VCO. We made that change last year. And the committee did want to hear from them, not in just a board meeting, but in one that committee members can ask them questions. And then the other kind of major thing was for the last couple of years, we said, should we shorten it? Should we hear from all departments, no matter no changes? And it was pretty much unanimous that folks want to hear from all departments, no matter if there's changes or not, and kind of keep the schedule similar. So we've added EDCO and VCO, Health Services, Long-Term Forecast, now the Sheriff's Office to the April 29th meeting. And we have retained the budget schedule as before. We have moved the kind of a series of elected compensation meetings started on April 29th. But other than that, those have been kind of the major differences. We've also looked at our policy, and we do require major funds to have a 5-year forecast.
Can we just back up for just a moment?
Sure.
With the elected officials compensation committee meeting that same day, one of the things that we want to point out is the salary study, the wage study. Kathleen mentioned that we're going to be looking at our comps. Do we have the right comps? Do we need to change those comps? We're going to go to the Board of Commissioners to ask who should our comparables be? We've used the same jurisdictions for a long time, and if those change, our goal is to have that change made in an orderly time so that HR, which kind of leads the process of evaluating the comps for the elected officials, can then prepare the recommendations, or at least the analysis, for the elected officials compensation committee to review prior to this meeting. So that'll be one of the first steps in that study that occurs. So I just wanted to share that.
Right. Yeah.
That'll influence.
In that process, it might be helpful to have just a short conversation with the elected officials, those who want to contribute, because I've heard of some. I've had some input saying that there may be some reason why this doesn't work and that doesn't work. And so I think if you heard directly from them, I think they'd feel good about that.
It's a great idea.
Yeah.
Okay. So along with those kind of schedule changes and having those EDCO and VCO present, we are asking major funds to do a 5-year forecast, which is in compliance with our fiscal policies that we've had the last few years. Most major funds have, but one of the feedback that we did receive from is that you guys really liked the presentations and they were standardized across the board. So I think we're going to do that for the 5-year fund forecast as well, so people can kind of see the same type of forecast throughout. And then to ensure transparency and ORS compliance, I think this year we've decided to route all departmental budget inquiries through email to the finance department. That way that all budget committee members are on the email and receive the same information prior to April meetings or budget week meetings. And then all affected departments can respond to the questions. Sometimes when meet with an individual department, their special requests, especially as general fund contracts and discretionary funds contract, one department's special request can in some ways influence or have a negative impact on another department's special request. And it's not always easy to know that unless you're coming from the county-wide view. So we want to make sure that we include all departments, all budget committee members, and that way it's part of the public records request. And then the ORS emphasizes public meetings and transparency so that citizens understand kind of what's being involved in the budget process.
So explain the mechanism.
Yeah.
So
the mechanism would just be email myself, email the budget team, and then we will go ahead and CC the entire.
you reply to everybody to any question.
We will reply to everyone and send it to the relative departments, even if there's multiple departments affected, and then each one of them can respond back so that we have all those answers in a public record. Mm-hmm.
I'll just apologize in advance for increasing everybody's email traffic over the next 6 months.
Well, but
Jim, keep your questions to.
But it's okay too. I mean, this is the procedure of it, but it's okay to have this traffic, and it's knowledge for everybody.
Yeah, this is great. We want everybody to be fully informed. So when they're making the decisions, they know exactly what they're doing. I mean, this is part of the obligations that departments and county staff, we need to respond back to get you the best information possible. We just need to make sure everybody gets it in a transparent way. So. Yeah.
Well, and some of us as civilian members, in fact, I would venture to say all 3.5, 4 of us in the of the civilian members do have other roles that we play, and obviously the commissioners have a much wider role than the budget committee. If we need guidance in terms of, you know, are we crossing the line by, you know, in another job by doing something? Is that something we reach out to finance or to county council or to both of you? I mean, I don't want to go through hypotheticals. I don't need to bog down a meeting for that. I can do that. I could do that with Doyle, but
I mean, I think you can just run it through finance. My guess is that there's probably not a conflict of interest there, but I mean, just run it through us. And if we don't know, then we're happy to route it through county legal for sure.
Just keep communication open.
right. It's, I mean, what I always say is, sometimes the easiest way to avoid a conflict of interest is to acknowledge a conflict of interest. And on that, you've never actually asked me, I don't know if you've asked other people, is, should I actually be talking a lot more or, you know, keeping a record of some of the various, you know, public-private things that I do that actually impact the county, just to make sure that we're acknowledging that there might be conflicts? I mean, I usually do it in the meeting, you know, I abstain on any service district discussions or anything like that. But, you know, as I'm working with a nonprofit that's requesting things from the county, typically I have somebody else go do that. But is that something that I should be acknowledging? I just want to be, I do want to be transparent. I'm in this for the long haul. I don't want to get myself in trouble.
It's a good question. One of the things I did when we did the interviews is I mentioned that I work for a nonprofit. that
Yes.
at times gets grants from the county. And at the time, they just said, you know, just if you're have a conflict of interest, you recuse, and a potential, you just note it. That's what I think. I don't know.
So actually, it's interestingly enough, our auditor recently did provide some feedback on us updating our policy to kind of address some of those. So I think currently right now it does say that that you make aware, disclose. So probably however we accept that would be best, but good feedback and thoughts as we go to update that policy to consider its impact on committee members, volunteers, etc. too. So, yeah.
I'd rather do it in ahead of time rather than suddenly realize in the middle of a discussion, oh, this is something that we should be aware of. I mean, I realize it's just me. I'm a unique individual, but I get told by at least once a day, hey, wait, I thought you were retired.
You know, people on committees, we're usually on a lot of committees.
Yeah.
Boards who are asking the counties, the city, the state, the federal government for things.
I mean, if we need a visual, I can bring in like 6 hats for the budget week.
Right.
I think Kathleen's got a good point. I think internally this policy will cover it, but externally, if you're on other things that I think there's an obligation, just let us know that you may be in a position that would jeopardize that. So just, I think, let us know for now, but it sounds like we might be looking at the policy. So, yeah.
And I run a nonprofit, we just give out a form and we ask, what
Oh, yeah.
other committees are you on? What other boards are you on? You know, I have 5 jobs. Want to list them.
Before we head to the budget calendar, is there anything else that folks feel like whether the board or the citizen members feel like in terms of updates to the budget process that they'd like to see during budget week or anything of that nature? It's pretty standard from last year, except we've moved the meeting from the early budget meeting from early May to April 29th to accommodate all the departments. But other than that, it's pretty much the same structure.
I'm actually looking at our current budget chair and saying, you know, from your wisdom, is there anything that we should be thinking about or looking about as we move ahead into what looks to be something that you entered all those years back?
Well, it sounds like the issues I brought up last year have been addressed, so I would be happy with the process as proposed. I thought it was valuable to have the budget committee hear the presentations. I wasn't able to make it to a couple of the off schedule presentations. I did miss that, so appreciate you considering that.
Yeah, and I'll say, I did appreciate, and I realize the onus should be on me, but I did appreciate the occasions where we would get a notice that would say, oh, there's our long-term financial forecast going up in front of the commissioners, or there's this going up in front of the commissioners. It's helpful to know that just to do it. Now, again, as a budget committee member, I probably should be, you know, scouring the
the calendar and the agenda and, you know, zooming in on any of those that go in. But if there's something very specifically that, you think that the budget committee would benefit, I'd always appreciate the ping.
Sure.
I appreciate the prior hearing, like from the health department's example. I love that. And it's helpful, like if the information next time like is different, like sort of like presenting and then presenting the same information during budget week. So, I mean, that's the only suggestion I would make.
Yeah.
I would,
Oh, sorry, go ahead, Commissioner Dare.
sorry, yes, I would like to make a comment. I noticed that we have 1,249 full-time employees. I don't want to see that number go up. I would actually like to see it go down. I don't know if you all are aware of the jobs number last week, but guess what was growing in the country? Government employees. And my husband goes, well, there you are, Patty. So anyway, we definitely need to work a lot more efficiently, and getting more employees at this time, I don't believe is a really a good idea. So please don't add anyone.
Okay. And then going forward, there is the budget calendar here in front of us. That's kind of the last thing to talk about. And like we said, no changes to the budget calendar per se. Besides that mid-year is moving forward. Budget committee week is during the same time frame. Same with the resolution to adopt the budget at this point in time. So and we'll be reaching out to department heads to kind of figure out when they want to discuss the requested and proposed budgets with the budget officer.
Yeah, and I have one question on the timing of the budget. I know that we moved the elected officials discussion to the 29th, and it's listed for 1 hour. I'm not aware of an elected officials compensation committee meeting that has lasted 1 hour. I think we tend to go over a little. And I know that we just discussed that going 9 to 5 on that day. So it sounds like there might be a little bit more wiggle room.
Yeah.
And my suggestion would just be that we factor that, especially if we're going to be discussing comps and things like that. I think there's a very good chance that we will not be done in 60 minutes.
Okay.
That would be
Noted. Duly noted.
Thank you.
Okay.
No, it's a good budget calendar. When I can't read it, I have to blow it up with my phone.
I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, actually. Yeah, so are there any more, obviously got comments, any other questions or comments from any of the commissioners or citizen members at this point in time?
No, thank you for all the information. Appreciate it.
Of course.
I'm gonna kind of echo where I ended last May with, you know, it's just kind of the comment of, okay, most of the organization, you know, obviously the big funds have all been raised to max rate. Even a lot of the, you know, smaller sub-organizations that are coming in are pretty high up on their rates. And this is the time to get conservative with your budget and start to really think about some of the long-term directions, because, you know, even as you've been, you know, saying, well, okay, it's usually 5.9, but you know, maybe it's going to be 5 this year. I know of another budget where we're living on 3.1, and it's good that many years ago, the organization said, well, we have to live on 3.1 to be able to get there. So I'm just, in general, I'm just encouraging all the departments as they start to work to be, to not necessarily ask for less, but to ask for what they need with a mind of what they can give up in the process. Everybody always thinks of what are the things I want to start and continue, but there's also the stop aspect of it. So think through the start, stop, continue aspect of all the things that you're doing in the budget, and have the hard discussion, because it's going to make an easy answer.
Well, thank you. Appreciate it. Very robust conversation. And we'll take everything back and try to get you guys the best budget week we can, and April meetings as well. So thank you guys very much. Appreciate it.
Well, thanks for all your good work, folks, and thank you for your consideration today and I encourage you all to keep the faith. You have a big job ahead of you, but if I had to pick a county to work with, it would be Deschutes. We have some real benefits here that other counties don't have. So congratulations on our success, one and all. Thank you. We'll be in touch. Meeting is adjourned.
Thank you, Bruce.
Don't call you, you'll call us.
Thank you, Bruce.